10th chapter, the beginnings and early progress of the visual arts. One might perhaps be inclined to conclude from the foregoing without hesitation that the visual arts must have begun immediately, since the desire to see the gods in visible form before one's eyes compelled man to sketch that form as best he could. But the matter is quite different, for the wish to imagine the gods in human shape does not at all include the ability to imitate that shape. Each exists independently, with the distinction that the latter is all the more difficult, as the former is all the easier. Indeed, the 30 deities had already long been worshipped before art dared to represent their images, and when it did, how did it begin? What the most primitive peoples in every climate had done, the Greeks did too, even though they had long since shed such primitiveness through their conception of the divine in beauty and love. Unworked blocks or rectangular stones represented Zeus, Juno, Diana, Bacchus, and so on. Even Venus and the Graces were such stones. Sometimes they were pillar-like stone blocks to which divine significance was attributed, as in the case of Jupiter Malichios at Sicyon and the oldest Venus at Paphos. Wood was also used. Castor and Pollux were represented by two upright pieces of wood connected by two crossbars. Yet, regardless of the difficulty of mechanical representation, how is it that in Greek art we still see no images of gods, even though by the time of the Trojan War, of the Argonauts, and of the Epigony, in short, the heroic age, entire figures, even historical scenes, are already found, as we learned previously? Among all the figures in such works, not a single one is of a deity. At most, they are moral beings, but, as said, without actual form and only in anticipation of it, as seen in the works of Vulcan and Minerva. Yet neither of these deities dares allow these subordinate beings or the other gods, their brothers and sisters, even though acknowledged as living human figures, to emerge from their own artistic hands. It is true that it is said the shields of the Trojans bore the image of Minerva, just as those of the Greeks bore that of Neptune. But Homer and all his commentators are silent on this, and the truth of the matter becomes all the more doubtful since we are informed in detail about the images on the shields of Greek heroes, and they never depict a god, but rather the hero himself or an animal. Surely a hero would have borne the image of the god under whose protection he stood, or to whom he was connected by birth or country. The gods, as named and described by Homer and Hesiod, were, to quote an Athenian philosopher, not yet depicted as long as the visual arts, in relief or in the round, had not been invented, and conversely, the reverent awe of representing the gods in images delayed the development of the visual arts, especially sculpture. Here I am speaking of large-scale sculpture. What Homer says about golden and silver dogs and about golden youths with torches in the palace of Alcinous could not have been full-round statues, but merely flat reliefs, cut out and fixed to the wall and of little size in the style of that time. And even if they had been actual statues, why did he not place the gods in sculptural form? Why does he not show them in temples, public places, or royal residences? And why does he let us see only altars on which sacrifices are made? Why do we miss them on the prows of ships where they were not placed until long afterward? There is no kind of carving like that, least of all gods or animals in round, bold, life-sized form. True, some Greek ships before Troy are said to have had dolphins on the prow, as Euripides says, but this poet, as we know, liked to project the later art of his nation into the earliest times, which were ignorant of such art. And if he was right, those ships may have been captured or rented Phoenician ships, for the Phoenicians used the dolphin on their ships as a symbol of their dominion at sea. One might also object that images of gods existed long ago if one recalls the Palladium of Troy and the Diana of Taurus. But I counter this objection by noting that these images were not of Greek origin. That is why the Greeks sought to possess such gods whenever they had the opportunity. If Castor and Pollux brought a famous statue of Mars from Colchis to Sparta, then the value placed on the possession of that captured god may have been partly due to the art involved, which was still something novel and extraordinary in Greece. One might, to make another objection, cite the Trojan horse, which was made of wood and of enormous size, the only work of sculpture in the heroic age that had a round, freestanding form, if it were not established that it was a war machine, a battering ram, to which the name horse had been given. But even if we grant that it was truly shaped like a horse, one cannot imagine that it conveyed much resemblance to the real animal, since its hollow interior, not its outward form, was the purpose of the construction. Thus, it belongs more to the art of building than to that of sculpture. The less a person knows about the visual arts, the more easily he is satisfied by the imitation of things he sees often. Even if the imitation is coarse and far removed from the original, he may even take it for perfect and beautiful. Had this horse closely resembled nature, Homer would hardly have missed the opportunity to sing its praise. But Virgil and other authors focus only on the size of the object, not on its artistry as a natural likeness. So in the heroic age and for a long time afterward, the gods were not presented to the eye in images, and the art of sculpture itself had not even begun. It was so unknown that the word for statue, both in general and with respect to various materials, does not occur in Homer or Hesiod. How then can this consistent absence of divine figures among the Greeks of that era be reconciled with their evident artistic achievements in every other respect? How could the necessity of representing the gods in tangible form have persisted so long without fulfillment? No historian of art has yet noticed this contradiction in Greek art history, though such a significant matter should not remain unexplored or unexamined. In my opinion, the cause is likely this. The human form, as the expression of God in beauty, demanded not only the most exact imitation, but also the attainment of that beauty itself. The more divine perfection was recognized in the beauty of the human figure, the more elusive that beauty became for the imitator. A vast gulf opened between the creative and the mechanical faculties, between imagination and execution. The thoughtful, philosophizing Greek, faced with the beautiful human form as a model for representing a whole world, did not know how or where to begin, not even to depict that form, let alone express the gods within it. Without the imperative of achieving beauty, he might have ventured without delay to represent the gods, as other peoples had done, producing pitiful monstrosities. The pure concept of beauty reigns in the nude. If man, unlike the animal, is born naked, why should the gods, of the same origin as man, not also be naked? And why should they differ from man, who, due to external conditions, which do not apply to the gods, is compelled to veil his naked beauty? The easier it was to conceal the beauty of the human figure in painted representations beneath clothing, and thereby avoid the difficult task of depicting the nude, the more pressing became the necessity to solve that very task. Moreover, the gods were to be shaped freestanding and at natural size, like human beings. But the aforementioned figures were flat and small, either engraved or embossed and attached. To such smallness the imitative hand was especially accustomed. I have already pointed out how sculpture remained long subject to this habit from its beginnings, and only with difficulty freed itself from it. Even painters, though at their origin inclined to depict life-sized figures, long avoided them and retained the small scale of figures for a long time, during which we do not hear that they engaged with divine forms or could have engaged with them. All of this combined to make it nearly impossible for art to imitate the naked, free, large, in short, the natural human form, and to realize the goal of expressing the divine within it. Everything conspired, so to speak, to delay both the depiction of the gods and the art of sculpture itself. Should we ask why? In the artistic representations of Homer and Hesiod, the gods never appear as figures as they do in the epics. Why only demigods appear as persons, never as figures? Mengs, Winckelmann, and others regard it as established that sculpture first tried its hand with clay, but I cannot accept this in regard to the invention of sculpture in Greece. For why did the Greeks initially set up a block or stone in place of a god? Why did they not at once take clay and shape it into a figure, when soft clay virtually offered itself for such an attempt, indeed demanded it if an image was to be made? But the stone was already the image. It was already God in a visible, tangible body. The strength and solidity which governed antiquity led to a preference for stone, wood, bronze, and other hard materials over brittle clay, which was considered incompatible with its ideals. Thus we find no evidence that statues, which for a long time were assembled from various materials, ever included baked clay as a component. Only when humanity, as a consequence of its improved condition, began to free itself from hardness and roughness, did it turn in its artistic pursuits to better means to ease the task. It chose soft and yielding materials that met it halfway. Satisfied with their success, it then returned, now as master, to the harder materials to which it had previously been a slave. Be that as it may, Dibutades of Corinth, of whom more will be said later, is said to have first used clay to shape a head. But then it is said again that Recus and Theodorus of Samos were the first to make complete images, by which I understand that they used clay. For when Demaratus, one of the exiled Bacchiads of Corinth, an event that occurred much later than the time of those two masters, came to Etruria, he brought with him the clay modellers Euchia and Eugramus, through whom the art of making statues from clay became known in Italy, especially in Etruria. From that point on, we hear, at least in Rome, about statues of gods made of clay and of no other material. Tarquinius Priscus, son of this Demaratus, had a clay Jupiter made by an Etruscan artist and set it up on the Capitol, where it was painted red on certain festival days. So, clay statues, although perhaps not entirely unknown to the Greeks, were certainly not native to them in the early period of sculpture. Only after their more refined sensibility had emerged, and they had already worked with metal and marble, materials corresponding more closely to their conception of the divine and the enduring, did they occasionally resort to clay. Therefore, it remains improbable that sculpture originated from clay modelling in Greece. If it had, the earliest known divine images would be clay figures, but we find instead wooden figures, those said to have fallen from heaven, like the image of Diana in Tauris or the famous statue of the Pantheon Venus. Clay images do not enter the historical record until far later. In the meantime, the development of art advanced, although still slowly and cautiously. As long as there was no imitation of the nude, there could be no true art. One made forms draped, statues dressed in real garments. Some of the oldest images of the gods were simply wooden frames over which real clothing was draped and regularly changed. We encounter this in the case of Juno in Argos, as well as with the statue of Diana in Ephesus, which was believed to have been shaped by heavenly hands. This explains how people could believe that the gods themselves resided within the statue, since the inner form was unknown, shrouded by ornament, and therefore shrouded in mystery. That made belief all the easier. This draped form was also retained when actual figures were eventually carved. The mechanical skill had not yet progressed far enough to grasp or dare the anatomical structure of the nude. Hence the sculptor covered his lack of knowledge by dressing his figure. The famous Daedalus, whom one must count among the first who truly sculpted entire figures, still clothed his statues and even painted their faces and hair. This was done to enhance lifelikeness and compensate for the limitations of form. To be sure, these were images of the gods, but not yet beautiful, not free, not Greek. They were images, not expressions. From here, progress was made only step by step. The limbs, first stiff, gradually became looser, the form emerged more and more clearly from the drapery. Finally, nudity was ventured, but only partially. The arms and feet were bared, and this was already seen as bold. Only later did the boldness increase, and even then, only in the representation of young gods, especially male ones. Female nudity came last. Venus remained clothed for a long time, and the Graces too. But once they were finally unveiled, the effect of the figure was so overwhelming that no one wanted to see them clothed again. What helped sculpture most in its development was the Olympic Games. For the victorious athletes were commemorated with statues, which led the artists to study real human forms more closely than ever before. These were not gods, therefore they had no reason to be clothed. On the contrary, they had to be shown in the splendour of their physical perfection, and this nudity was itself a badge of honour. Thus, practice and competition brought forth truth, accuracy, and beauty. As the imitation of the human form became more perfect, it became the model for the gods themselves. What had once seemed too difficult now appeared possible. What had once been feared as irreverent was now taken as homage. The gods were shown as men, but as ideal men, in whom all the highest perfections of form were united, and this was the moment when Greek sculpture entered its prime. The gods were no longer abstract concepts, but real, visible beings, and man no longer trembled before them, but loved them, saw them in his own image, and saw himself in theirs. This is the true Greek religion, a religion of beauty, born from reason and imagination, raised by art to its highest glory. 11th chapter, Founding of the Philosophy of Forms, or the Invention of the Ideal. When philosophy had plunged into the essence of being, and imagination had visualized it in human form, the visual arts, destined to complete this visualization, had to align themselves with both. I mean to say, since the gods could only be perfect, and their perfection was identical with the highest thing known to man, beauty, art had to strive to achieve beauty in the imitation of the human form, in order to make divine perfection visible through it. But its ability was hindered by the lack of understanding of the perfection on which beauty is based, or else it was, in its eagerness to comply with the imagination, so overwhelmed by the comparison between divine perfection and the beauty of the human form that it found it necessary to ennoble the latter to the highest degree. And thus it acquired the power to create what I call the philosophy of forms. Since the mathematical examination of the human form is limited solely to what is necessary, it does not elevate it above itself, and thus it always falls far short in expressing divine perfection and beauty. The Greeks, as long as they remained faithful to the Egyptian method, saw in their images of the gods only ordinary humans, poorly suited to the dignity of divine beings. The idea that the gods stood only one step above humans already pointed to the necessity of elevating their form above the human. A fortunate thought which spared them the danger of either exaggerating the divine form into monstrosity and caricature, or of abandoning it altogether and removing it from sight, whereby in the first case violence would be done to the spirit, and in the second the spirit would turn inward and become dejected. The benevolent gods, beings of eternal love, left it to humans to draw the boundaries of distance between themselves and the gods, and rejoiced when those boundaries were drawn so closely together. Thus the standard for the divine form was found. In discovering his likeness to the gods, man took the standard from himself and enlarged it only by as much as the step by which he had placed the gods above him. Though superhuman and supernatural, it was still comprehensible and reasonable, a greatness which, while filling the eye, simultaneously captivated the soul. Poetry, the forerunner of all arts, was here the example for the visual arts. The mother of poetry, wonder at the great and powerful in nature and in man, adopted art as her child and introduced her to that mother as a sister. At a time when the heavens, divided between love and hate, in alliance with the elements, often threatened to destroy Greece and each time renewed it even more beautifully, when the abyss of death sometimes opened, then life bloomed forth all the more luxuriantly. When fate, in alternating anger and compassion, pronounced and revoked death sentences upon humans. When these people, in terrible conflict, pursued each other with the gods, or allied themselves in sweet harmony with them. When the craft of war was a light pastime and no other game existed than that of warfare. When warriors bore shields weighing many pounds, lifted and hurled enormous stones, when a lucky throw or a desperate act of bravery and courage determined the prize and possession of a royal bride. When even executions used duels as a test of strength, as a noble condition of life or death, at this time imagination, swallowed up by the force of nature like a raging sea and thrown back up, transformed into these very forms, from the abyss in which shapes of terror and awe reside, gave birth to theogonies and cosmogonies. These were interwoven with the most important fates regarding the origin and development of a nation, or they sketched a gripping tableau of the original or divine power and the derived or human power in their cycle and in the mixture of both. From there, it poured itself into the tumults and battles of gods and men, where sometimes the gods fought among themselves for the sake of humans, sometimes the humans among themselves for the sake of the gods, and sometimes both against each other, exhausting themselves in struggle over the preeminence of strength and power. Thus, the human abundance of power was that of the higher beings as well. It was their nature, their perfection, their beauty. The Father and King of the gods surpassed all others in strength in the same measure as they surpassed humans, albeit in proportion to the lofty position they held in relation to humans. Jupiter was therefore named the leader of a warring party and was given the epithet of warrior and general, and other gods, as protectors and commanders under him, received weapons and marched to war. He himself, exalted in power, directed the fortunes of war from Olympus and weighed out fate. Therefore, in some images, Bacchus, Mercury, and other gods retained armour in memory of victories. Even female deities often used armour and weapons to express their power. Pallas Athena was born with them, and even Amor and Venus bore projectiles as signs of the power they held over gods and men. Indeed, many deities of both sexes appeared with thunderbolts in hand. And this is the poetry that guided the visual arts and taught them to make power and greatness reign in exalted superhuman proportions in the form of the gods, and to let them be admired therein as truly higher beings. Perfection of strength in the structure of limbs and body size was thus the embodiment of divine beauty, which art was to express. It needed only to cast its gaze on the gods and heroes of Homer. The beauty of strength is the character of both, but strength achieved through training in battle, military strength, is a male deity and is called Ares or Mars. Mars, god of personal bravery, contrasts with Pallas Athena, goddess of intellectual strength and inventive power, both of which must necessarily unite in war. This beauty of martial strength, which the Stoics with Diogenes Laertius call the bloom of virtue or courage, is expressed in the love of Mars and Venus. Homer did not sing it without reason, in the person of the bard Demodocus, to the suitors of Penelope, who indulged in idleness and allowed their strength, through which alone they could have won the clever princess to slumber. For the beauty of strength is alluring and irresistible to us. Strength almost compels beauty to attach itself to it by force, or beauty feels itself violently drawn to it. And so both mix in love, from which the famous adultery of Venus with Mars derives. From this union, as the sculptor Andron claimed, harmony was born, and with this he meant to say that, just as strength and beauty agree agreeably in bodily structure and muscular power, this should be shown in a single sculpture, and this should represent the highest ideal. To strength belongs size and fullness. Homer always connects greatness with strength and dignity. Thus, for example, he has Pallas increase the size and fullness of Ulysses' form when he appears before the Phaeacians, thereby giving him a divine appearance, so that everyone honours and loves him and finds him fit to compete in the contest to which he is subjected. He makes large stature a permanent distinguishing mark of the gods, which they, in turn, bestow on their favourites. Among others, when he describes Penelope in her beauty, he compares her to Diana and Venus, and points thereby to the distinction between male and female beauty in terms of strength. To male beauty, he unites Mars with Venus. To female beauty, Diana with Venus. But to him, Diana represents the practice of the hunt and the strength beauty thus acquired, so that he sees female beauty likewise grounded in strength, though not in martial strength, and inseparably tied to tall stature. In his works, Diana always grants noble women a tall and strong nature, such as the daughters of Pandarus, just as Pallas, on the other hand, bestows upon them domestic skills. Because of this, and other aspects of their beauty, he praises the Spartan women, who were known to harden themselves through all sorts of bodily exercise in order to be worthy of their men and to propagate a strong race with them. Likewise, the Crotoniates, a republican people in Italy, boasted of their equally beautiful young women and young men for this same reason. The divine appearance of strength and size he frequently presents in his poems as a gift of the gods and formulates from it a saying which must be interpreted by us as beauty granted by the gods. Hence he even has the enchanted companions of Ulysses appear, after regaining their human form, younger, more beautiful and taller than they had been before, because Circe, whom he calls a goddess, could do no less. The heroes he treats in regard to form like the gods, and how could he have withheld from them who strove to resemble the gods the exalted beauty of strength, this divine gift? that the men of earlier times, and especially those preceding the age of heroes, were considered taller in stature already made them godlike. All the more so, then, must the heroes, a divine race, be so endowed, for they were the ones who established and followed the fundamental rule that man must secure the greatest glory of his life through a fullness of deeds, for which his physical advantages destined him. Just as the gods revealed to humans that they, though mortal beings, came closest to them in visible form and figure, so the heroes strove to free themselves from the slavery of mortality through the conscious exertion of strength, through action and creation, in order to come as close as possible to the gods, to stand opposite them, or to be their counterpart, as Homeric expressions clearly explain. Strength and power were therefore considered divine qualities, and indeed attributes of the highest God, which Hesiod illustrates beautifully when he says, "Strength and force, noble children, were begotten by Styx, and they do not dwell apart from Zeus, nor linger anywhere that he does not go first. So inseparably are they joined with Zeus the Thunderer." Homer describes the essence of strength thus: a large stature, broad chest and shoulders, rounded hips, strong arms and legs, powerful muscles, and a firm neck. In this manner he depicts Ulysses, and so that nothing would be lacking in the perfection of his figure, he adds, or rather precedes it with, the remark that divine grace enveloped his head and chest. This expression he uses often, for he imagines a body only as perfect in beauty and grace, equating them with the divine and knowing no beauty or grace apart from deity. Thus did poetry present its treasures to the visual arts. It showed how the gods must be made beautiful and the heroes divine. The strength and power of divine beings is manifest, and their free spirit infinitely removed from all secrecy, deceit, and coercion. Thus the visual arts had to depict them in unveiled nakedness, and establish as an unalterable rule that this representation be maintained at all times. What it deemed necessary for the gods, it also deemed necessary for the godlike man. Gods and heroes should, in the majestic beauty of their naked limbs, inspire awe in the viewer. This, in turn, reflected back upon the Greeks and justified their custom of appearing naked in contests, in certain religious rites, and often in everyday life, largely dispensing with covering. This was tantamount to remembering the gods in their own form, showing themselves godlike, or exhibiting bodily beauty as a divine gift. Nature itself instructs man to turn the noblest part of his formation, his face, toward the heavens, and in this gives him the clearest sign of his higher origin. And the philosophizing Greeks followed this hint in the human form, and, because of its excellence, considered it entirely as face, and wholly directed it toward the heavens. To hide nothing was to be the Greek way, distinguishing them from ancient and modern barbarians who harbour a declared aversion to nudity, and, with premature modesty, traitor to conscious sensuality, betray their ignorance of the true and exalted concept of the highest masterpiece of sensual form and its divine significance. With male and female deities, with heroes and heroines, the form of both sexes had to be necessarily distinct in regard to perfection and beauty. In this, they obeyed an inner feeling, according to which the idea of man and woman transitions from the former to the latter, but not vice versa. They noted that the cause of this lies in the advantage of strength which man holds over woman, who indeed has strength too, but of another kind, by which she challenges the man's strength to combat with hers, yet succumbs to it. This determines the difference in the beauty of the sexes. Female beauty is yielding strength allied to the invigorating force of morality. Male beauty is conquering strength over the moral strength of femininity. In man, the body is conditioned by the spirit. In woman, the spirit by the body. What man is to God, woman is to man. From this it follows, since form belongs to spirit and spirit is nobler than matter, that spirit alone is the cause of beauty, and that this is to be sought only in man. The male sex of our age has sunk so low as to deny its own beauty and to seek it in the female sex instead, and thus to call the latter, preferentially, the fair sex, when it ought rather to be called the charming, the graceful sex. According to the above distinction, the Greek artists ennobled the frailty of the female form with an element of masculine firmness and strength, guided by poetry, without which they could not have given goddesses the necessary majesty and dignity. They cast about them the necessary but tasteful clothing, yet uncovered certain parts or brought the beautiful bodily form as a reflection of the divine masculine visibly forth under the garments, as the Egyptian sculptors had already done, as their statues of female deities uniformly show. But where the character of a goddess required her to be portrayed entirely naked, they, as if unaware, disregarded the physical sex characteristics which the woman modestly conceals, and by omitting even the faintest trace of these in their sculptures, they declared them to be an opposing element to art, insofar as art must express the highest aspect of female beauty, namely morality. But in the representation of gods and heroes, they did the opposite, because they otherwise believed they would be offending against the generative power, the condition of male perfection. They therefore depicted the male body not only as child and elder invariably with the mark of this superiority, but they often applied the most visible care to it, especially in the flourishing times of art. Indeed, the sculptor Myron was reproached for having neglected the hair, the ornament of manhood, and for having thereby imitated the roughness of antiquity. For in this adornment too they saw nature's intent to distinguish man from beast, and to indicate the superiority of his sex, such that this hair in its place is to the body what the head hair is to the face, and simultaneously a warning not to disgrace one's nobility and dignity by excessive and unworthy indulgence in love. According to what has been said, the establishment of physical exercise and athletic games was the most important part of Greek education, and it follows naturally that the body, in order to move freely and without hindrance, had to be naked. This gave both the visual arts and poetry the opportunity to observe that the human structure is an artistic vessel of inner strength, which can freely and variously spread and reveal itself as a blessing. Just as, according to Seneca, nakedness displays to the eye the beauties and defects of the body, so too it allows one to perceive the significant difference and superiority of a trained body over an untrained one, which compelled art to a close examination, namely, to determine how power and effectiveness, as the root cause of physical existence and the form of all living beings, which through action refreshes this existence and makes it pleasant, produce that which elevates the shape of man to the image of God, or what constitutes his beauty. Familiar with the mathematical appearance of the outer form, art extended it to this beauty and made of it a science which, as such, was to be cultivated and made universally valid. And so arose the philosophy of art, which I, in the narrower sense, call the philosophy of forms, which is the higher part of art, and of which I will speak further below. Mengs was the first to say that philosophy had already in some sense distinguished itself before the invention of the graphic arts. He continues, "One sees in the taste of the oldest art the course of reason and reflection, and not of the imitating and self-abandoning hand. The artists first directed their attention to the general proportions and then to the muscles, as in these two parts lies the most necessary and useful aspect of the human figure." I will attempt to develop this further. Lines are the basic principles of form. The straight line is the line of size, height, and length, or of measurement, and is divided into the upright or vertical line and the lying or horizontal line. The former is the line of motion, the latter of rest. The former is light, the latter heavy. The other lines are composed of both and are similar to the tonal scale in music, or to the degrees of light and shadow which arise from the mixing of black and white. All lines considered as measures are subject to number, and the circle contains them all in its centre, which, as a point, is original, independent, and necessary. The line of height or length is the line of existence and of the present. It is the foundational line of the structure of the animal body, and, in the sensual sense, what the keel is to a ship. Now, the skeleton is based on this line, from which the bones emerge as derived lines and to which tendons and nerves attach as accompanying lines. The structure of the quadruped, the first creation after man, is the horizontal line or line of length. That of man is the vertical line or line of height. This difference between the structure of animal and man determines the superiority of spirit over matter, which, being light and active, must move in a straight and upright form. The ancients discovered that the straight or baseline of the human figure is counterbalanced and offset by the opposite one, and that thereby the equilibrium between the height and width of the figure is determined, and the appearance of the figure established, such that a body is either slender, light and graceful, or short, bulky and unpleasing. They observe that bodily strength has its axis in width, which the horizontal line provides. And since, in a warlike state, what is called perfect and beautiful is that which is necessary and useful for self-preservation and courage, this line made the strongest impression on them, and they therefore agreed to lower the line of height in order for the line of width to dominate. In doing so, they noticed the pressure of gravity and recognized that it proceeds in graduated steps. For the forefoot is the support of the foot of the thigh, and the thigh of the torso, or conversely, the greatest pressure from the greatest mass, the torso, presses upon the thigh, the lesser weight of the thigh upon the foot, and the still lesser weight of the foot upon the forefoot. Yet for the sake of movement, two supports, the legs, were necessary, which would divide the weight of the trunk between them. This pressure is lightened through such distribution, as it acts upon the aforementioned limbs, which mutually support and lift each other in descending degree. It also points to the relationship between the length and thickness of these limbs and to the line of the forefoot, which, despite its shortness, is sufficient to carry the whole weight because it lies horizontal. From the body, they turn to the head. The face, the sum of reason's rules in created nature, the finest and most meaningful work of its hand, rests upon the aforementioned straight line, which is clearly noticeable in its section against the front or against the space that surrounds it. The final purpose of this line is evidently to indicate the nobility and excellence of man, for since no other line can move it in opposition, its firm resistance produces the grand, the majestic, and the sublime. How early and how precisely the Greeks recognized this is proven by their figures of all kinds and all times. For the facial line is always straight and vertical, and it even repeats itself in the smaller and movable parts of the face. They who had elevated man to a god, or imagined God in man, rejoiced in expressing this in the face, the foremost and ruling part of the human form, so that they made the straight facial line an unbreakable law, and thus raised modern art above ancient poetry, which never exhibits the slightest trace of it. They considered any deviation from this line as a degradation of the noblest being after God, and where they noticed it in nature, they took it as a sign of her wrath, and if to an extreme degree, as a branding of evil traits and condemnation to lowliness. The heads of slaves and barbarians were always formed thus. Finally, they came to the clothing of the bones with flesh. The flesh consists of parts called muscles. In the exertion of the body, the muscles swell, and through constant exercise they retain this swelling. The artists applied to this the infallible rules of measure and number, just as they had applied them to the proportions of the skeleton upon which the musculature is based. In doing so, they discovered an equilibrium of force in pressure and counter-pressure, and in this the law of movement. They therefore clothed the body with muscles according to this discovery, though not beyond the overall impression or the unity of strength. Hence, they brought forth only the necessary and prominent muscles all the more emphatically, and had no eye for the smaller ones, so that from many small ones they formed a larger one, which appeared sometimes in the arch of a semicircle, sometimes like a compressed wide bow, and sometimes like a flattened hill, and in its contact with similar ones produced powerful indentations, angles, and recesses. Theocritus precisely expresses this firm and protruding shape of the flesh when, in describing a resting boxer, he compares the muscles of his upper arm to large stones rounded by a mountain stream. Winckelmann speaks of a Tidrus carved in carnelian, which he considers an Etruscan work, where the bones and muscles are indicated with great understanding but are hard and appear as if forced or pressed out. But the comparison of the parts of the body and their proportions to one another pointed to a point of certainty, to a standard that had to be found beforehand, and to a comparison that would act with the force of a law. Just as nature varies in the size of body structures, and art, which seeks only the perfect, must choose, among these sizes, that which corresponds to its concept of perfection, so too must it, in the parts of the body that offer themselves as measures, choose the one that seems to it the most perfect in this regard. We moderns use the head and the facial length as measures of the body, and it turns out that this standard is as variable and unreliable as the division of the face into nose lengths. The Greeks, guided by the principle of perfection in strength, could only derive this measure from the impression of that strength, and this impression is gravity, which manifests itself in the architectural nature of the body. When they recognize that the pressure of gravity proceeds from top to bottom, diminishes gradually, and finds resistance in the horizontal line of the foot, which balances the force of gravity with itself, and that this subordinates the form of the parts, they believed they had found this measure in the foot, the smallest part that carries the whole. Among all foot lengths in the human world, they thus chose one as a measure of body height and elevated it to the form of perfection in strength, to the ideal. Allow me to pursue my thoughts further and to venture a conjecture which has offered itself to me through the comparison of various circumstances in the history of art, often most mysterious in its most important matters. The marvellous and extraordinary of past times and of the people who filled them remained the model of imitation for following ages. Hercules seems to have recommended himself to imitation more than all other heroes of antiquity, so much so that one sought fame even in coming somewhat close to him or resembling him in some respect. The art of the Greeks, which from the beginning strove to express the perfect and the best, could only seek such models of imitation as antiquity presented to it. If it had established heroic bodily size as the perfection of man, its choice had to fall on a trained warrior, an athlete. Who was, in this respect, more famous and more worthy of imitation than Hercules? And if it occurred to them to use foot length as a measure of the body, why should they not use the foot of this hero? Although he had long since left the world, the measure of his foot had, by chance, been preserved, as the following reveals. It is known, says a certain writer, that Hercules, when he founded the Olympic Games, measured the race course at Pisa with his own feet and made it 600 feet long. The race courses in other places in Greece were also 600 feet long, but nevertheless somewhat shorter. From this, it was concluded that the foot of Hercules, compared with that of other men, was proportionally greater, as the Olympic race course, compared with the others, though equal in number of feet, was longer. According to this measure of Hercules' foot, the proportions of the entire body of the hero were calculated, and it was found that Hercules surpassed other men in stature by as much as the Olympic racecourse surpassed the other racecourses in length, even though they shared the same number of feet in count. So far the author. The greater foot length of Hercules compared to that of other men, even those who were warriors and athletes, brought, in my opinion, the idea to the art of using it to measure the body, elevating the size thereby derived to the ideal or the size of perfection, and bestowing it upon divine figures. What may strengthen my view is the description of a Hercules epitrapezius by Statius, of whom he notes that he was 1 foot high. And what foot could this be other than that of Hercules himself? How could an artist have dared to use the common foot length as a standard for the first and greatest hero of antiquity, without exposing himself to the reproach of gross ignorance and contempt, since all inventions regarding proportions and symmetry were established in art as secure and immutable rules? This little Hercules thus possessed the measure of his foot, which in him had been established and sanctified as the measure of perfection in strength. Despite the assumed foot length of Hercules, the body structure did not increase in height, as one might think. Rather, it remained subject to the horizontal line, or to breadth. For the oldest figures barely had 5 foot lengths as the measure of a regular body, and thus it was short and overly broad. A figure of this kind, and perhaps even below this measurement, was Antis, who was said to be nearly as broad as he was tall, and due to his heaviness, was called a darling of the earth. Neck and shoulders were firmly grown together. He had short arms which, like his belly and chest, were thick with flesh. The chest was broad and flat, as if spread with a hammer. The legs had an outward movement, and overall he resembled an animal. I do not deny that this is an ideal of strength of the most primitive natural man, which forms the most striking contrast with the ideal strength of gods and heroes. However, that does not prevent Antaius from having been a giant, only that, due to his clumsy breadth, he could not have been tall in stature. Yet the artists of an age in which natural power and bodily strength were still a very general necessity, and the highest beauty could not concede this, because they saw both, as just mentioned, grounded in breadth, and therefore did not want to diminish it with height. Of Hercules himself, it was known that he was not of particularly great stature, and in Homer and Hesiod, the gods and heroes appear in their praised greatness, but never as giants, that is, as we are accustomed to imagine a giant. Accordingly, bodily size was never excessive, but the limbs were widened according to the concept of strength, and this widening was what constituted the greatness. And just as these limbs exerted greater pressure, so the base of the whole, the foot, had to be proportionally large, that is, just so much longer as the weight of the body structure or the pressure of gravity required. And thus one sees in the best sculptures that the forefoot is longer than in nature, and that this length precisely determines the size of the figures, especially those of gods and heroes and of persons one wished to elevate to one or the other. Even if Hercules had not served as the model in this regard, a measure still had to be determined that reason found natural, even if it had not itself defined it. Just as, to make a colossus, the artist enlarges the smallest part of a form or the smallest muscle, whereby the larger ones must also be enlarged, which extends over the whole figure, so too the human figure had to be expanded by means of the lengthened line of the foot, though not with respect to height, but to breadth. And the heightening of stature is a necessary consequence of breadth, but subordinate to it, not superior, and therein lies the surprising majesty and grandeur of the figure, which could never enjoy this effect through the mere elongation of form without corresponding breadth. Hence a poet exclaims about a small Hercules, a masterpiece by Lysippus, "A great god in small bronze. I believe I have rightly understood the Greek measure using the foot and made it convincing. It served solely to determine stature according to the proportions of the limbs in strength, and how infallible this measure was is also shown by the story that Phidias inferred the size of a lion from the claw of a lioness, which gave rise to the well-known proverb. Art recognized the form in the necessity of strength. From this, as from a centre of certainty, it drew the lines of this form and referred them back to it, or assessed the proportions of the human figure solely according to it, and restricted the concept of beauty to it. This required great reflection, which is indeed visible. The beauty of this form was to the Greeks a world in which they immersed themselves, and which allowed them to think of no other than this world. The human figure, to man the first and highest, was to express the first and highest beyond man, and thus, in creative art, to occupy the foremost place opposite the eye. They therefore placed it before themselves as a spiritual statue, and transferred to it the immobility of the contemplative and probing mind, the inwardness of the soul, along with the coolness of measurement and calculation, to the imitated subject. And thus the work was straight and firm, horizontal and square, but imbued with inner strength and power, and animated by boldness that sprang from the confidence of proportion. Hence, the statues of Daedalus, that is, of the earliest masters, had, despite all the poverty of art, the inexperience of the hand, and even the roughness and hardness, the value of greatness and inspiration with which the soul had filled the design. And this is what is called the ideal in art, ruling spirit in greatness and fullness of form, awakening the dead to life, the earthly to the heavenly, the human to the divine. And so, among the ancients, reason, or the philosophy of sensual impression, had taken possession of the human form and founded it upon strength as the cause and sign of its divine nature. With such a secure method, they built the foundation of the future perfection of art, by which they, to be sure, had not yet reached beauty, nor could yet reach it. Nevertheless, we will gladly see how they developed this form more and more to the highest perfection, and in doing so, surpassed even themselves. 12th chapter, Invention of Painting. Now that I have described the idea of painting among the ancients and examined and explained the nature of the material, and since I have presented everything that concerns its appearance in Greece, which I had to introduce beforehand as an introduction to its invention, I now come to the invention itself. If in Greece the belief in the personhood of higher beings required that they be seen in human form, and if the power of imitation called for their representation and thus gave rise to sculpture, then it was precisely this art that, by its very nature, impeded the conception of painting and delayed its invention. For by keeping the senses bound to the round, tangible form and appropriating the need for colour, thereby creating that hybrid thing I referred to under the name of plastic painting, it prevented the conception of independent form without body and colour, and maintained a long and stubborn misunderstanding between the two. The corporeal and colourful character of sculpture alone was the reason that painting could not yet be invented and was in fact discovered only later. Pliny, who did not consider this and could not consider it, therefore reproaches the Greek writers for their lack of diligence, claiming they mention painters much later than sculptors and engravers. How unfounded this accusation is obvious. But behold, what had not occurred over millennia among any people on earth happened among the Greeks. In their philosophical inquiries into the structure of the body, starting from the idea of beauty, they discovered its cause in form, namely that shape in matter is ennobled through form, and that there is a distinction between form and body. According to this, form precedes the physical and subjects it, or that form is an object of the spirit and self-sufficient, whereas body or matter is an object of the senses and dependent. In short, that the physical or matter is not, as was previously believed, itself shape or form. Can we still wonder that such a long time was needed to perceive this difference and make this conclusion? Just as form has beauty as its goal and beauty is the object of love, it was love that guided art in its investigation of form towards its essence. Remarkable enough and yet true. The story that a girl in Corinth invented painting is well known, but it has not been rightly understood and has been explained as a mere fable by some who reject everything because they fancy themselves clever, yet remain on the surface of the matter. The story tells it in the quiet tone of truth, and for that very reason briefly and precisely. The daughter of the potter and later clay modeller Dibitades of Corinth had fallen in love with a young man. He had to travel away, and the girl, seized by longing to hold him back, traced the outline of his face or of its shadow on the wall by lamplight with a line. Another version says the young man was asleep when this occurred, which is unlikely, not only because lovers do not sleep at parting, but also because the drooping face of a sleeper distorts resemblance in the waking state. So love knew how to sweeten the painful separation from the beloved object by preserving his image. Yet no author has dared to see in this event the invention of painting, or to credit the Corinthian maiden as its true and original inventor. We moderns, on the other hand, are ahead of them and assert it directly, or are at least inclined to do so, because we place the essence of painting in line drawing. It was not the girl's intent to invent contour, but by making it, she invented it unknowingly and unintentionally. Though humans daily saw the outer form of things and even the much-desired resemblance of the face expressed in shadows, no one had yet had the idea of outlining it. It was reserved for the subtle and all-observing love to grasp the idea and shame the dull and unperceptive sense. Just as mere chance has often brought about the most significant inventions, so here too it was an accident that led to the discovery of the flat contour. Greek art did imitate the essence of form, but it had to be content to see it only in the mind and not with the eyes, until inventive love came to the aid of its philosophy and showed it how, through the maiden's idea and her happy attempt, the invention of the contour, and thus of painting, must be made. It was the egg of Columbus which the love of the Corinthian maiden presented to the wisdom of Greek art. Hardly had this event become known when art, sensing its advantage, seized upon love's work and made it its own. For now several people simultaneously began to outline the shadows of things with lines, and this caused the legend of the first invention of painting to become confused and contradictory. I will therefore try, through careful investigation, to come as close as possible to the truth on this point. Crato of Sicyon, it is said, wiped the shadows of men and women onto a whitened board. I use this expression because it is more familiar to us moderns, as we use shading in mass for a drawing, whereas the Greek term means smearing or rubbing in. From this, I infer that Crato outlined the shadow of a person, which the sun or lamp cast on the white board, with soot or some black substance using his finger, and rubbed and filled in the inner area of this finger trace completely. The perceived likeness of the person, which was now a black surface that fatigued the eye, led it outward to the contour of the shadow image, the seat of likeness, or to the pure outline alone, which suggested the idea to make only that, without filling in the middle with black. It was done, and the Greeks name Philocles of Egypt and Cleanthes of Corinth as inventors of this attempt. Sorius of Samos is even said to have outlined an entire horse's shadow on the wall. Aristotle states that Euchre, a relative of Daedalus, invented painting in Greece, whereas his student Theophrastus names Polygnotus of Athens as the inventor. And to complete the tally of these accounts, or to throw them all over with a single one, as it were, the Egyptians claim they were the ones who brought painting to Greece and had already invented it 6,000 years earlier. We shall now examine these accounts one by one. Crato, it seems, was the first to make use of the story of the Corinthian maiden's experiment. At least he deserves to be placed among those to whom the invention of painting has been attributed, even if he did not immediately recognize form in the shadow or distinguish it from it. The immediate attempts of others following this first one contained the true invention of painting, in that the black space was omitted. I do not know how the Egyptian Philocles came to the honour of having a part in this, for the Egyptian, entirely incapable of conceiving of abstract form, could not possibly have derived it from shadow, and therefore could never have hit upon the outer contour of the shadow with this intent. Still, it will be seen whether and what he contributed to the invention of painting. Various attempts at outlines then appeared in different places, and of all those who engaged in this, it is said that they drew simple lines around the shadow of the head. In this way, the hand was compelled toward precision and accuracy, and the likeness of the facial structure was necessarily achieved. The daring attempt by Sorius, however, suggests the imitation of other objects besides the human figure in natural size, and initiated the expansion of the newly invented art of outlines. When the Athenians, in the persons of Polygnotus and Euchre, came forward as competitors for the invention of painting, it likely happened because Athens wished to claim or truly had precedence in all inventions and their cultivation. As for Polygnotus, I take him to be the one from Thasos who freed himself from the rigidity of the old art and contributed most to its perfection, and thus, as the Greek expression has it, stood out as the first painter, indeed, as though he had invented painting itself. He also received, in return for his great work in the Stoa Poikile at Athens, for which he would accept no payment, among other honours, the right of citizenship in Athens, a mark of esteem frequently granted to distinguished foreigners. However, no author refers to a Polygnotus who was a native Athenian. As for Euchre, I cannot possibly concede to him the right of this invention, even though the authority of Aristotle supports it. For Aristotle names him a relative of the famous Daedalus, who lived before the time of the Trojan War, when the art of outlines or of painting as a graphic art had not yet been invented. I hope, therefore, to be excused. But in order not to accuse the aforementioned philosopher for a falsehood, I think he must be understood to mean that Euchre painted the statues of his relative with colours, thereby, as it were, animating them, and the impression he made in doing so led to the later custom of decorating statues with colours. At that time, the colour on sculptures contained the notion of painting, and since Euchre first introduced painting into sculpture in his country, he was declared by his contemporaries to be the inventor of painting, and was regarded as such by later times. Indeed, I am inclined to believe that Euchre, by partaking in the fame of Daedalus through this innovation, based his supposed kinship on it, or else that there was, very likely, a much later Daedalus, that is, an artist who lived in Athens, whose pupil Eucia was, and who first imitated the Corinthian maiden's experiment in his native city. And in this way, Aristotle, who did not examine the matter so closely, could still attribute the invention of this art to an Athenian in the person of Eucia. As soon as the discovery of form in shadow had been made, the desire arose to fix it in something lasting. The method already common in inscriptions suggested itself, namely engraving. Thus, around the shadow image on the smooth and receptive wall, a line was drawn with a sharp tool to hold the shape as firmly as the changing shadow would allow, and the inner area of the outline was left blank and without shadow colour. It is noteworthy that the outer line of the shadow, outlined in this way, was made all the more deeply and forcefully, and the form was, so to speak, pressed inward in the groove of the line in order to compensate for the lost, accustomed impression of projecting roundness. To this was added the already sharp exterior of the shadow, which, combined with the fear of losing the captured form or not sufficiently securing it, produced a hardness that remained characteristic of painting for a long time, and even as it approached perfection, did not want to vanish, as we will hear. Meanwhile, this engraving is noteworthy in two respects. First, painting, as we see, returned to the method of handling hieroglyphs, only with some differences, and seemed to appropriate them. And this circumstance gave the Egyptians, especially because it was likely initiated by their countryman Philocles, the opportunity to claim the invention of this art, and to regard themselves as its forerunners, without noticing the most obvious contradiction in their proud and premature presumption, namely that it is entirely different to engrave an outline with the intent of extracting the image from the enclosed space than it is to use the outline to express the external form. So when one speaks of the invention of painting in Egypt and its transmission to Greece, we know how to take it. Secondly, since the Greeks practiced painting in small plastic figures in the form of writing, and then conversely outlined life-sized figures in their shadow on the wall, engraved them there, imitated the forms of things for their own sake, and thus transformed writing into painting, or restored painting to itself. This united with the former in the naming of the new art, so that writing and painting were designated with one and the same word. Just as writing was for them painting, painting was also only writing. When painting emerged from the service of writing, it underwent a transformation, from elevated relief into recess, and consequently into the slavery of engraving. Thereby it saved its existence when it had lost the essence of its being in the rough treatment intended for it, and this gave it its name, though it had to forego its proper one. So difficult was it for the concept of painting to rise and become independent. But as this art spread from Greece to the rest of the world and was shared in its perfection, it had to shed its adopted name and take on its rightful one. Hence, in other languages, its name has retained nothing of the notion of engraving. The next step in the development of painting was the discovery of filling in the outlined space with a single colour or tone. We owe this step to the same principle that had already led to the discovery of the outline, the shadow. People had long noticed that the shadow thrown by light was dark in colour, and that this darkness, depending on the proximity of the object to the wall, was either more intense or lighter. They wanted to use this means to further emphasise the figure. Thus they applied black, in the manner of the first attempt by Crato, not merely around the lines, but over the entire interior space they enclosed. In doing so, it was observed that the application of this black, which was sometimes done by smearing and sometimes with a brush, added expression and fullness to the image. The eye, accustomed to seeing things dark in shadow, was satisfied with this form of representation. In the same way, this painted shadow stimulated the imagination to produce the appearance of the entire body, just as the shadow itself, which was cast by light, used to do. So once again, a misunderstanding between shadow and form occurred, but this mistake bore a benefit, for now the idea arose of how the painted line and the filled-in space of this line might jointly create the image of a body. In short, one had reached the concept of a plane or surface. As this discovery spread, the previously engraved contours were gradually abandoned. Painting now appeared in its own right, flat and colourful. The desire to give greater expression to the shadow with the help of colour led to the use of a second colour. Initially, this may have been only a weaker tone of the first, or it could have been pure white, which was contrasted with the black and represented light. Gradually, they added more colours and shades in order to make the representation even more vivid and lifelike. Yet, in the beginning, it seems they used only 4 colours. These were white, yellow, red and black, or perhaps it was the famous 4-colour palette that later Greek painters still used and whose invention was attributed to Polygnotus. Even in this early stage, the art was no longer entirely bound to the shadow. It had gained a certain independence. Form no longer had to be derived from the shadow. Instead, it was created out of itself through the outline and the use of colour. Thus, painting stepped fully into the world. From this point on, the development of painting accelerated. Just as with all inventions, the time that had been lost in forming the first idea was quickly made up by the speed of its elaboration and perfection. Once the concept of contour, surface, and colour was understood, all that remained was to explore the inner life of the image, expression, motion, and the harmony of parts. The figures began to stand, to walk, to act. They turned their heads, lifted their arms, bent their knees, stretched their hands. Everything came alive. The new art seized the spirit, stirred the imagination, filled the heart. Thus, in the image, man became present once again. What philosophy had first sought in the idea of beauty, and what sculpture had begun to shape in body, was now fully realised by painting on the surface, the ideal form of the human being, expressive, beautiful, alive. Thirteenth chapter. The beginning and progress of the art of drawing. The act of tracing a face in shadow did indeed produce the greatest likeness, which remained even after the shadow had disappeared. It was pleasant to see a person on a blank surface, to call them by name, and in this way to possess twice over the father, the wife, the friend, or the beloved. To see a figure as in a dream, yet more real than a dream. To see it, but not to grasp it. To have a permanent presence, yet an actual absence, alive and yet dead, itself and yet not itself. This was something for which fine words could hardly be found. But all this stirred the desire for something more, that the inner space should be depicted with equal truth, that the figure might appear completed. People realised this was possible, and found a way. But what harsh conditions it imposed. The timid hand had to renounce the faithful and gentle guidance of the shadow and submit to the strict authority of the eye. For since the inner parts were not outlined in the shadow as the outer shape was, imitation had to pass from the shadow of the person to the person himself, and in replacing the inadequacy of the shadow, raise itself above it. Since the lines had to be given flatly, just like the outer contour of the shadow, this led to the realization of form as something self-contained and belonging to itself. The stubborn error that the form was one and the same as the body was finally entirely shattered, and yet the form was brought from mere existence into visual apprehension. The first who dared this experiment were Ardices of Corinth and Telephanes of Sicyon. It is said that they still drew outlines without any colour, but they already placed individual lines within the figure. Most likely, they marked only the most prominent parts of the face, the nose, the eyes, and the mouth. Gradually, they moved on to the hair, to the divisions of the hair's fall, to the ears, then to the arms, the legs, and so forth. The clear understanding of the independence of form from the body brought these early practitioners much closer to correct and faithful imitation than our own beginners in drawing, who are not taught this, and therefore begin and finish everything mechanically and without comprehension. Furthermore, the things one has discovered for oneself provide far stronger incentives to develop than those that are already known. So this gave these men courage to defy the difficulty they faced in moving from the shadow image to the original, to the point that they now disdained to borrow the contour of the figure from its shadow, and instead stole it directly from nature. That their attempt was successful is evident from the addition of the name next to the drawn figure, as though there had been no difference between the person and the depiction. From this, we can understand the report that Eumarus of Athens, was the first to indicate the difference between male and female. Since the similarity and difference of the sexes are immediately apparent on the outside of the shadow and are impossible to miss when tracing it, Eumarus, to earn praise in this respect, must have gone beyond the shadow and created heads from nature, striving with utmost care to render the subtler inner features of the face. These must have been the faces of young people in whom, due to insufficient detail, the gender remains doubtful, as is the case with some Greek coins of the earliest period, where the facial features express more a mathematical design or the imprint of certain established laws than individual, distinctive truth. Emboldened by this successful experiment, Eumarus now ventured onto all kinds of figures, that is, on people of both sexes and all ages, and thus created faithful likenesses of persons, both in terms of the resemblance of the face and of the entire body. The daring attempt to render form without the precedent of the shadow now encouraged others to imitate things whose shadows were inaccurate, unformed, or monstrous, and therefore utterly unsuitable to be traced, or things whose size and scale were not suitable to be reproduced on the limited surface available to the stylus. This compelled the hand to reproduce these things, grasped at a single glance, on a reduced scale, and to make the interior consistent with that. Here belongs the attempt of Saurius, who, besides the horse, also began to trace other things in shadow, but soon realized that this method could be applied to very few objects, and was therefore compelled to tackle the objects themselves, directly. The abundance of things that could be imitated must have greatly increased enthusiasm for it, and gave the inventors of painting the proud notion that they had not only expanded the boundaries of this art to the infinite, but had, in effect, become the absolute masters over everything visible in living and dead nature. Now, animals, trees, houses, and whatever else could be imitated began to appear, and here too one was so successful that the work could be compared to nature itself. Therefore, no one hesitated to inscribe, "This is an ox, a horse, a tree." But here I hear the objection. Pliny and Aelian, who agree on the matter of this inscription, seem to mean the exact opposite of my interpretation. Aelian, at least, says quite openly that this was done because the imitated objects, being crude and poorly executed, could not be guessed without their designated names. To this I reply, this author is merely a collector of anecdotes, striking events and facts from antiquity, and it is well known that in such an undertaking one is not always conscientious regarding historical truth, and often guilty of hasty or mistaken judgment. Moreover, I find Aelian in the most striking contradiction with Pliny on this point in the history of art. For when Pliny refers to the early attempts at outlining the shadow of people, he says nothing of name inscriptions, nor does Athenagoras when he speaks of these attempts, even though it would have been all the more natural to do so, since the outline contained the most exact likeness of the person. But since that likeness was already contained in the shadow itself, and the fixing of it with lines was indeed an entirely new action, but still not yet an art, the name inscription was omitted. It was only once the outlines were taken directly from nature and drawn by free hand that people began to add this name inscription. The striking resemblance of the face made it a duty, especially since it had to be rendered by the artist's own hand, to imitate the inner features with conscientious fidelity, so they might withstand comparison with the accuracy of the outer contour and match it. That was therefore an entirely different matter. Its importance, arising from the difficulty that had to be overcome, and which far outweighed the inviting ease of tracing a shadow on the wall, became evident. And as this succeeded more and more, its importance grew to the point where the arduous task of imitating nature with lines was thought to be solved. For this reason, says Pliny, these masters began to inscribe the names of the depicted persons, almost as a justification of their faithful imitation and for their own satisfaction. When one was capable of achieving the most difficult thing, and to prove it stamped the depicted person with their name, how could one have failed to imitate with equal success other lifeless and immobile objects, like houses and trees? It thus becomes clear that Aelian is gravely mistaken when he explains the inscriptions of the imitated objects as arising from their unrecognizability and the crudeness of the execution. This opinion is also disproved by the fact that the figures of the most ancient Greek coins, which show representations of animals and other things, also include names. And these are not there to clarify what is depicted, for the images are quite recognizable, but to honor the city or region that minted them, or the person the image represents. Thus, the owl on the Attic coin, the dolphin on the Rhodian one, and so forth. One must therefore distinguish between inscriptions made for practical reasons and those made for honor or attribution. After the hand had gained practice and familiarity with depicting a wide variety of objects, it turned back to the human figure with renewed zeal. The knowledge that had been gathered by imitating other things and the dexterity that had been gained from them now improved the drawing of the human form. The figures became more proportioned, fuller, and livelier, though still only from the front and in profile. Movement, expression, and composition slowly made their appearance. One saw sitting, walking, stretching, bending, embracing, everything that life had to offer, and the artist began to enjoy in his own creations the fullness of life he had captured. At this stage of development, the most notable contribution was the invention of drawing in multiple views. Not just the strict profile or full front, but also the three-quarter view and figures turned in space. In this way, the figure began to come alive and painting entered into competition with sculpture. These gradual improvements eventually produced a comprehensive school of drawing which brought together everything that had been discovered. The achievements of each artist were now compared with those of others, and those who combined the best qualities in their work were considered the greatest. Yet at no point was art seen as complete. It was always being advanced further. The Greek spirit, which never stood still, drove the development forward through both competition and reflection. It was at this point that the great painters of the so-called ancient style appeared, especially those of the Sicyonian school, which for a long time was the most esteemed in Greece. Among them, the most celebrated were Cleanthes, Ardices, and Telephanes. These men established the principles of drawing, and their influence lasted even into later, more developed times. Yet one must not assume that the old style of drawing was universally crude or undeveloped. On the contrary, it often possessed a noble simplicity, clarity, and expressive power that later art, with all its technical brilliance, could not always surpass. Even in the best periods of painting, when colour and perspective were mastered, artists still looked back to the early drawings of these pioneers and studied them with reverence, as one studies the roots of a great tree, not for their beauty, but for their indispensable strength and necessity. Thus drawing, the true foundation of painting, grew out of a simple act of love, the shadow of a departing face, and became a full-fledged art form through the tireless effort of many hands and minds. It began with the outline, gained depth through internal lines, achieved fullness through colour and light, and finally attained motion, character, and the unity of composition. Its path was not one of sudden miracles, but of thoughtful, continuous progress, marked at each step by both necessity and insight. What began as a fleeting trace became, through intelligence and will, one of the noblest achievements of the human spirit. 14th chapter, Origin and Nature of Monochromatic Painting. The monotony of the incised lines on a white surface and the dull impression they made on the eye eventually fatigued it and awakened all the more the innate inclination toward colour. It was tacitly admitted that it was too much to ask to renounce this inclination in the case of an emerging art, just as it was to suppress the need for protruding, rounded form. Two sacrifices at once made it likely that painting would make no progress and would not meet with favourable reception. Moreover, sculptural works had always been adorned with colours, and painting had been seen as part of this adornment. How then could actual painting dispense with or deny them? But since this art originated from the outline of the shadow, which is in conflict with colour, this origin itself bore, as it were, a prohibition against colour. The opposition gave rise to fears that painting, this long-awaited art, might return from its barely glimpsed existence back into nothingness. Yet as little as one was inclined to nourish this fear, just as little was one able to suppress the drive toward colour. This created a tension that, without a middle ground to satisfy both sides, necessitated the victory of one over the other. The middle ground was found. Painting was to be allowed one colour only, and shadow should be reconciled with it. Even if the deeper instinct of free imitation of nature had already begun to dismiss the shadow as a guide to form, it was now all the easier to resolve to unite the outline of the imitated object with colour, so that this outline would remain a shadow, but only in the company of colour. However, this led to a struggle whose outcome, while it abolished colourless lines, also showed how weak the human spirit was in overcoming them. We shall observe this struggle and examine its result. The surface of bodies is governed by light, which produces in it the incomprehensible quality called colour, so that light must proceed for colour to appear. The movement and intensity of light govern its rule in relation to the receptive nature of bodies, and hence arise infinite variations and gradations of colour from their fundamental tone. Colour is therefore the result of the attracting force of light and the repelling force of the matter that receives it, a struggle between the movement of the former and the rest of the latter, an attack and resistance, a fermentation, agitation and mixing into being and life of matter, the form made visible to the senses. The more intense the struggle, resistance and agitation, the more splendid this life, the more beautiful the colour. Form, through colour, has its second existence in matter. Through it, it softens its austere character and more agreeably connects to the spirit. Colour is the blooming, ever-youthful bride of the austere, abstract and self-contained form, wed to it by the erotic power of light, the union of the changeable with the self-sufficient, the accidental with the necessary, the temporal with the eternal. Now it becomes clear why primitive man, weak in spirit, and anyone like him, has a stronger desire for colour than for form, and why he first gets to know form through colour, and only gradually learns to distinguish the two. It also explains why red most flatters the senses, and is regarded by all people without exception as the most beautiful colour. Indeed, nature itself seems to declare in its favour, having spread a gentle red hue over the human body, especially imparting it to the face. Now, painting originated from the outline of the face in shadow, which subdues and kills the colour of the surface on which it falls. Yet because the aim was to imitate the face, this implicitly called upon shadow to unite with red colour. This union seemed impossible. Since shadow entirely excludes colour, it offers the eye no path to it. And the discovery of such a path was further complicated by the fact that the sense was increasingly distracted from colour, as form insisted that the spirit should remain solely with it. But eventually a solution was found to escape from this entangled position. Colour was to be regarded as something self-contained, which, however, should be situated between light and shadow, yet equally distant from both. Drawing, as shadow, was also to exist for itself alone and be placed on colour as a middle ground between it and light. Thus, there was an enforced union of shadow and colour, and they touched only through their opposition. But the way to grasp the colour came from the overall impression, which did not permit one to see in it anything other than an uninterrupted quality of the surface. Since painting consisted of outlines on a surface, colour too had to be a surface, a spread-out mass. In fact, it took the place of the shadow of the lines through opposition, or it was made dependent on light through this shadow. But the untrained sense perceived in it more the nature of shadow, so that it gradually and with great effort transitioned from it to light, as the gradual development of painting in shading and colouring proves, which is as instructive as it is pleasing to the observer. So deeply had the impression of the human form been seized by the shadow of man that even in colour it saw the property of shadow, and thus the truth was made manifest, that the eye only perceives the objects of vision through their shadow, and first learns to comprehend light through it, doing exactly the opposite of what happens in nature. Cleophant of Corinth was the first who dared to combine simple lines with colour, or, as it is literally stated, to colour them. The word colouring, which Pliny uses, might lead one to believe that red was painted over the drawing. So vague and imprecise are certain expressions of the author, which therefore require much caution to avoid misinterpretation. For colouring applies to the surface on which the lines were made, not to the lines themselves. Thus, he inadvertently transfers the colour to the drawing instead of the drawing to the colour. Moreover, it was not a matter of painting with wet pigment. This colour was red, and if the text can be trusted, it consisted of ground-up shards of earthenware vessels. If this is true, then one must suppose that over the wall where the outline was to be made, while it was still semi-dry, a layer of powder from these shards, or brick dust mixed with strong lime, was spread and allowed to dry together with the lower layer, to then incise the drawing upon it. This is not at all improbable, as it is known that the ancients devoted much care to the firmness and smoothness of the wall coatings, and therefore made them of several layers. Assuming this, one sees how painting on the wall, its original substrate, pursued its development, but it certainly did not fail to pursue it also on wood and in other ways, as we shall hear. Why, then, would Cleophant not have applied the well-known red earth to the wall? I answer, since the outline was made with force on the white wall, it could not be passed over with a wash mixed from lime and red earth, partly because the colour would have become weak and pale due to the addition of white lime, partly because it would have been too thin. Thus, the beauty of the colour would have been sacrificed, and the intended boldness of the incised line would have been nullified. It was therefore necessary to use red powder, which in larger quantity and with more body combined with lime in a sufficient ratio, and by its more adhesive power bonded more firmly with the lower layer. Moreover, they surely had the experience that the earth colour, when applied unmixed and dry on the wall, did not withstand air and moisture, and when it rained, it would seep into the grooves of the white drawing and dissolve them. Cleophant may have been encouraged to unite red colour with drawing by the example of his fellow countryman Dibutedes, for this one had mixed red earth colour with modelling clay, or perhaps used it directly for his figures, presumably for reliefs and representations. Both artists, therefore, joined hands in regard to colour. Now, because the stylus cut deep enough, the drawing appeared white on red. However, the extensive red colour was not dark enough, so that at a certain distance the white lines were lost in it. Colour and drawing, however, were to be equally strong and in proportion to the force of the incision. Therefore, I'm inclined to believe that the red colour was mixed with black to darken it. For paintings on a small scale where they are viewed closely, the red might have remained unmixed. The need, in larger works, to make the white lines distinctly visible finally gave black the advantage, as I will soon prove. Since the drawing, as shadow, had to take precedence, it was natural to place it upon the surface and make black the ground of the drawing, upon which the latter appeared white. Even though this reversal of colour put the white drawing in contradiction with the black shadow, its origin, the eye still perceived in the black surface the mass of shadow dominating, in which it sought its satisfaction. The uppermost layer of plaster was presumably prepared from crushed charcoal, as the admixture of charcoal in some mortar layers at Pompeii shows. Now, painting was divided into white, red and black, but in such a way that only two were ever combined together, while the third remained excluded from the connection. We will now look for examples of this alternating combination. The paintings from Tarquinia in the Papal States contain drawings in white on black, or as Winckelmann says, figures with outlines of lighter colour placed on a dark ground. Although he saw these paintings and described their content, he omitted the detail of the outlines being incised on a coating, alternately of this or that, but always of dark colour. The encaustic engraving on ivory, which I will discuss at its time, deserves a special mention here because ivory was purposely chosen for drawings in white. Both types of painting prove that black or a similar colour originally had the preference over red, which was a kind of homage to shadow. These paintings are from the earliest time of art, at least the oldest that have come down to us. We find further references to works made explicitly with white paint, for Zeuxis is said to have painted in white. This work, since it comes from an artist flourishing during the time of complete artistic development, can have no place here. I mention it only because I see no other opportunity to refer to it and to correct an error prompted by a passage in Aristotle, which is supposed to refer to this type of painting. Aristotle says that tragedies lacking in the expression of passions are like paintings that have no spirit and character. Even if the painter has applied the most beautiful colours, he achieves as little as if he had used only white. The philosopher does not speak here of paintings made entirely of white, but rather means that a painter, with all the colours he applies, without metaphysical power of representation and without inner content in his work, achieves no more than if he had painted only with white, that is, used no colour at all. He refers thus to actual colours as opposed to white, which is not considered a colour or not addressed as such alongside true colours. Just as beautiful speech and melodious verse in a tragedy do not compensate for the lack of expression that grips the soul, what he calls the ethos, so too do both remain ineffective without this expression, like beautiful colours in a soulless painting, which relate to the eye no differently than if everything were white. For paintings made of white, especially by the hand or in the manner of Zeuxis, must be artistic, full of meaning and expression, just as any drawing can be, and thus such a drawing can readily dispense with colour, and so Aristotle would have contradicted the truth. Crate's recommendation to execute drawings in black ultimately prevailed, and rightly so. Examples of black outlines on a white background are found in Plutarch, as well as of golden outlines on black backgrounds. All of this concerns painting in its perfected state. Most commonly and nearly universally, we find such outlines on red grounds. This is especially evidenced by the so-called Etruscan vases. These works also belong to the time when painting was nearing perfection, or had already reached it. The pale red, often yellowish colour of the very fine clay, which was likely mostly ochre and terra sigillata, forms the background or field of the drawing and serves to highlight it, though such that the surrounding space is entirely painted black to subdue the assertive brightness of the colour with shadow. The abundance of these vases makes it highly probable that painting from the beginning was practised by potters or ceramic artists and continued throughout the ages, adding new weight to the claim that the daughter of the aforementioned potter Dibutades has the first and exclusive claim to the invention of this art in silhouette. Demophilus and Gorgasus, of whom I will speak shortly, were both ceramic artists and painters at once. These potters likely maintained the exercise of this art continuously alongside professional painters, though in the form of its original invention, namely in linear form. And the Greeks, as previously stated, honoured the memory of the origin and the earliest form of their most important inventions through all ages. In the 249th year of the city of Rome, or the 75th Olympiad, cinnabar was discovered in Greece and introduced into linear painting. The beauty of this colour, its brightness in comparison to the dull tone of red earth pigment, was so captivating that at first people wanted to see nothing but cinnabar, until the very excellence for which it had been admired was found to be a defect. A surface blazing with cinnabar stood out too sharply from the faint, albeit black, lines, which were as though sacrificed to this colour. This issue, and the difficulty often faced in obtaining it, led people to abandon it and return to the previously neglected Sinopic earth. Overall, the struggle that painting had to endure with cinnabar served to make it more cautious in the future. And so the appearance of cinnabar in this art was very brief, and not a single monument remains to us that shows its use in the manner described. Among the paintings of Herculaneum, there are 4 panels of white marble upon which excellent line drawings are made with a kind of mud. Winckelmann believes this colour to be cinnabar that darkened under the heat of the glowing ash in which the panels were found, but it could also have been another red earth pigment. In this case, one could accomplish much with a small supply of what was then such a rare cinnabar. Drawings in red on white must have been as common in fully developed art as black drawings on white and red, as Horace implies. In the book of Ezekiel, there is mention of a painting in red, although it is uncertain whether the outlines were black or white. I favour the latter. It states, "When she saw images of the Chaldeans engraved in red on the wall." The translators of this passage, who knew nothing of the origins of painting, have made varied translations and interpretations of it, never quite capturing the meaning, or they have not dwelled on it at all. Only Castellio renders it more precisely, though confusedly, saying the figures were engraved on the wall and at the same time impressed with red earth colour. The Greeks translated it as drawn or painted with synopic earth, a word which also means engraved, and in this way they were engraved white drawings on red. The engraving of a drawing on a surface of varying colours led to the expression to engrave with or through colours, that is, to bring out the engraved drawing in a contrasting colour on a surface prepared with this or that pigment. In scripture, and in religious and other writers, especially Anastasius Bibliothecarius, this expression is frequent. It is also used in reference to metalworks in various colours that have engraved or embossed images. It is remarkable that, after the death of painting as an art, drawings in black on red survived or were seemingly revived, as one passage in particular shows, which states, "The error had not yet crept in, such as now occurs, where images of the saints are made and venerated from black and red, or with black colour on minium or on synopic earth." Thus these were the efforts of painting toward colour, yet they achieved no real progress, for colour and drawing still remained separate from each other. The philosophy of vision had not yet discovered the cause of colour, light, in order to effect a union between form and colour. Indeed, it first had to recognise this cause in the form itself and trace it outward to colour, while also distinguishing colour from light, and yet uniting light and colour with form. A difficult matter, so difficult that for this reason alone painting spent the longest time on it, although in other respects, namely in the higher art of seeing, it was already perfected, as we have seen. For in the spirit of art, in ideal truth, it relied on the power of the independent and the divine. In the natural aspect of art, in physical truth, it was guided by the eye, which, left to itself, it was strictly bound to. There, reason goes first. Here, it follows behind. There, it dictates freely. Here, it is conditioned. Thus we see in the progress of reason here so much doubt, indecision, hesitation. In short, the constant searching and wavering between light, colour and shadow. Pliny reports that the introduction of single colours into painting was called monochromatic painting, that is, painting with one colour. Furthermore, it was customary to speak of drawing with lines, now on this, now on that colour, to paint with individual colours, hence the expression monochromatic types also arose, always referring, however, to the colour of the ground. Because of outlines in black, this painting was called black or charcoal painting, as well as colourless painting. If Crates, by initiating outlines in black, made himself known as the inventor of the art of drawing, then this honour did not fall to Cleophant, even though the colour he introduced paid tribute to the sensual need, an observation that fully justifies the insight into the unequal relationship of colour to form, namely the recognised superiority of the latter over the former, or the soul of painting over the body. During the restoration of art by the moderns, engraved drawings on walls in black on white were revived and practised by many, especially by Polidoro, with great skill in terms of shading. This work is known in Italy by the term sgraffito. Pliny states that drawing on individual colours was the second state of painting. However, his classification of painting into epochs applies only to its practical aspects, not to its aesthetic progress, for which he provides other epochs, setting them alongside the former, and thereby, since he praises the art as perfect each time, leading into a labyrinth from which one cannot escape without a well-guided thread. I may confidently place the beginning of monochromatic painting within the first 10 Olympiads, for Pliny places the earliest masters of it before Bulacus, who, as mentioned, gained fame in the 18th Olympiad. These masters were named Hyginontes, Denias, and Sharmas. The rest are lost to history, although this new invention may have found many followers and prompted frequent attempts. However, we still see monochromatic linear painting alongside another entirely different kind, or another type of painting existing concurrently which has never been previously noted. I have shown how the invention of outlines gave rise to the art of shallow relief, true plastic art. Just as sculptors, without the hint of this invention or of painting, would not so soon have conceived the idea of expressing objects in cross-sections of mass, or of transitioning from the wholly undivided roundness of figures to half or shallow reliefs, and thus inventing sculpture. so it was all the more welcome to them to join with painting in the plastic and to share in its properties. By this I mean, insofar as Dibutades filled and raised the cut-out outline with clay, this outline was unavoidably necessary for the design of a plastic work, whereby sculpture remained connected to painting. However, in regard to the mentioned filling and raising, it was the opposite of painting, because it occupied the inner space of the outline in a completely flat way, and the outline was, in this respect, recessed. On the other hand, since the works of the sculptors were made of materials of contrasting colours, and were thus assembled for their colour, anticipating painting or intending to embody it, sculpture here remained like modelling, sharing itself with both painting and sculpture, and taking its place between the two. Thus, a new type of painting emerged, one that united the need for outline with the elevation of form, and with this, colour. In short, a new plastic painting arose, distinct from that older one through the mentioned need and through its shallow treatment, but similar to it in the imitation of colour. And precisely because flat monochromatic painting did not permit a multiplicity of colours, this new plastic painting received permission from sculpture to make up for that deficiency and thus supplement the art of painting. This art now appeared in two forms and perhaps spread more widely in the colourful plastic version than in the single-coloured flat version, because the eye was more pleased by the former than the latter, which also proves how slowly it progressed in detaching itself from round, tangible form. And so the artist could practice painting in both forms simultaneously, and painters could be sculptors, just as sculptors could be painters, and both were in their union a single person. Pliny indeed speaks of two Greeks who were both relief sculptors and painters, one named Damophylas, the other Gorgias. He praises both in this dual capacity, though more as sculptors. They decorated a temple house in Rome with their works in this double manner. When it was later restored, these works were cut out and mounted in frames, indicating that they were small-scale figures or miniature paintings, for with large paintings, as we have already noted, this was not possible, since no distinction between the two types of work is indicated, that is, aside from the sculpture, no actual painting is mentioned. I have every reason to agree with Winckelmann that they were executed in both arts simultaneously, namely that they were raised images on a flat surface, for which the material had first been combined with the chosen colours, and thus prepared, then applied wet onto a previously engraved drawing with a sharp stylus, and afterward dried and hardened. Before this temple decoration, everything in Roman temples had been Etruscan, as Pliny reports in the same place. This gives us a sense of the period in which these Greek masters lived, namely not long after Demaratus, one of the exiled Bacchiadae from Corinth and the father of the Roman king Tarquinius, had brought two ceramic artists named Euchre and Eugramus to Etruria, and through them made shallow relief sculpture known in Italy. From Pausanias, we learn that Clearchus of Rhegium was a sculptor and a pupil of the mentioned Euchre of Corinth, who perhaps lived at the same time as Damophilus and Gorgias, or at least was from the same school as theirs. This type of plastic painting was therefore formally taught and practiced alongside linear painting. From it likely originates the practice of adorning large statues with shallow relief works, depicting figures and other things, using colour rather than forming them in plastic colours, until plastic painting was discontinued, at which point actual miniature paintings were applied instead. Later, even that ceased, and shallow relief sculpture appeared in its proper form without colour, and painting in its own without plasticity. This descent of painting from the plastic to the flat, or the increasing dominance of the latter over the former, is clearly evident to the attentive researcher in the history of sculpture. The time when painting completely parted ways with sculpture, and sculpture likewise separated from colour and became independent, is the age of the great Phidias, or the era of completion and perfection of the art. He was the one who restricted sculpture solely to the shallow roundness of form and to the effect of light and shadow in small figures, which he made into explanatory accompaniments to a great central work, as notes to a lofty text. Just one more word on sculpture. Its invention is ascribed, besides to Dibubutes of Corinth, also to Rhoecus and Theodorus of Samos, long before the expulsion of the Bacchiadae from Corinth. However, it seems more likely to me that these two masters merely heard of this invention by the contemporary Dibutides and were the first to imitate it on Samos. Be that as it may, the invented sculpture, as the master Pacites admits, was the mother of statuary in bronze and marble, and of engraving and chasing. For us, sculpture refers to any work involving the greater or lesser relief of the form on a surface and made from any material, whether with the thumb or modelling stick, or with chisel or engraving tool, however it is executed. Pliny, on the other hand, understands by sculpture only works in clay or materials similar to it, encompassing both the imitation of things in shallow relief and in undivided volumetric form, namely statues, busts, pedestals, and the like. However, the shallow relief work in ivory, metal, marble, glass, and so forth, since all these materials require a treatment opposite to that of clay and involve greater effort, is called by the Greeks toreftiki, toriutic, or anaglyphiki, anaglyptic. The Latins call it calatura, and we refer to it as engraving, chasing, or more broadly as relief sculpture. What a significant influence clay had on the perfection of the sculptor's art, and how fully sculpture has justified Pasitila's declaration, I will not fail to explain later. For now, this will suffice on the subject. 15th chapter, Appearance of Painting in Encaustic Technique. Although history has noted the progress of painting in both scientific and practical terms, it has concealed the causes and the chronological order of that progress and has left it to us to sort this out. We will only be able to do so if we free ourselves from preconceived notions and think ourselves as ignorant of the concept of this art as its inventors must have been, keeping before our eyes the time and circumstances of its first appearance, and from these grasp and bring to light the striving for improvement and the course of its inevitable development. Above all, we must consider that the earlier the time in which an invention falls, the simpler are the means employed by humans to reach their goal. Even though painting has, as previously mentioned, made its appearance in different forms simultaneously, that of flat drawing was nevertheless the true and only form of this art. For insofar as it satisfied itself in plastic colour, it distanced itself from drawing again, in that drawing was only necessary to define the outer contour and not applicable to the expression of the internal form. This difference became all the more striking the more it placed its strength in the free imitation of things with outer and inner lines, in the actual art of drawing, and asserted its essence therein. Thus, it recognised in plastic colour a loss of its essence, and when it allowed itself to be seduced by a preference for it, it immediately ceased to be what it was. Although it was unwilling to admit that it was being neglected in the plastic method, it nonetheless strove all the more eagerly to distinguish itself in linear drawing. The lines, the origin of its essence, surpassed the need for colour in terms of significance, as the aforementioned method, due to its focus on colour, removed the concept of the independent form from the eye. However, the engraving of the drawing on walls, the decisive circumstance of its invention, so greatly bound painting to itself that it could not bring itself to renounce this engraving. Moreover, the desire for firmness and durability forced it to preserve the lines in this way, yet rough technical means do not usually accelerate the development of a practice, as was especially the case with painting and its engraved lines, which had become sanctified by the origin of the art. But the wall did not offer the convenience necessary for practice and experimentation. A simpler method had to be found. The engraving itself pointed the way, for a glance at writing, which was likewise engraved, suggested what could be done. Writing used wax, which was spread and smoothed on small wooden tablets, upon which the letters were engraved with a stylus. These tablets were either simple or folded multiple times and made in a format convenient for the hand. The simple tablets had the shape of the Greek delta, while the composite ones had the form of a common book and were called sopichia, generally pinnacidia, wax tablets, Latin pugillares, writing tablets, hand tablets. However, because wax was too soft to clearly receive the letters, resin or pitch was mixed in, a mixture also used on ships instead of tar, and for sealing the interiors of earthen vessels used for storing wine and oil. Due to the increased dryness and hardness of the wax, these writing tablets were called hard wax tablets. Later, the wax was coloured black with charred Egyptian papyrus or with paper ash, and red with madder or cinnabar. The use of such wax tablets persisted for a long time. In the art gallery of Florence, among the medieval antiquities, there is preserved a travel expense diary of King Philip the Fair of France from the 14th century. It consists of thin sheets of oak wood in the shape of half a sheet of paper. Each sheet, to prevent warping, is set in a shallow frame and coated with black, hard, glossy wax. Even Leonardo da Vinci, in his book on the rules of painting, mentions wax tablets and the stylus. They were still in use in the 16th century, as noted by the German Bible commentator Franz Titelmann, who died in Rome around 1540 in his commentary on the Book of Job. Thus, painting began to practice on such wax tablets, and did so all the more readily because the art had always been accustomed to small figures. But if one wanted to enlarge the scale or combine several elements, the tablets had to be proportionally larger. For writing, since it was read up close, it was enough to make itself visible through its own shadow, which it achieved sufficiently in the recesses of the letters. Hence the wax was applied rather thickly. But painting, since it contained larger forms, had to be displayed at a relative distance from the eye. Therefore, the line engravings had to stand out from the background to remain visible. To achieve this, the lines had to be engraved all the way to the wood, which in turn had to be white so that, when exposed by the stylus, it contrasted with the dark wax background. A type of wood with the necessary properties was soon discovered, the female larch tree, whose wood is the colour of white honey, free of knots and cracks, like marrow, and more resistant to decay. For smaller works, boxwood may have been used, which has a fine and smooth core, for we still hear of drawing on this wood even in later times. However, wax tablets for drawing required a different kind of wax mixture than those for writing. For writing, it was enough for the wax to be dry. For drawing, it also had to be hard, because the painstaking and laborious painting was meant to last longer than quickly scrawled writing. If no regard was paid to this, it lay in the nature of the earth pigment. But to make the wax hard, in order to spread and smooth it, a special technique was required. When the writing tablets were coated with hot and liquid wax pitch, essentially tarred, the melted wax mixed with pigment could not be treated the same way, as it was not thin and fluid, but a viscous mass. Therefore, it had to be spread and smoothed with a hot flat tool. This tool was called kafkoster in Greek and viriculum or veru in Latin. In German, a burning stylus, burning spatula or burning graver, to distinguish it from the cold stylus, which served for writing. The procedure of applying and spreading coloured wax with the hot stylus was called encaustic, meaning that which is burned in. Because it aimed at durability and permanence through fire, the word encaustic came into general use, more so than almost any other word, without regard to differences in how the fire was applied or the materials it required. For example, the process of brushing hot wax over something, say over a surface painted with cinnabar to fix the colour and protect it from the bleaching sun, was also called encaustic. The term was not only used for wax painting on wood, walls and ivory, but also for painting on earthenware and similar objects. It was likewise used for metalwork, where gold or silver was applied, inlaid or fused, and finally for everything gilded or silvered by fire. Thus one spoke of gold encaustic, silver encaustic. Quite rightly, moderns refer to porcelain painting and enamel work as encaustic. The same term can even apply to the glass painting of the Middle Ages that we see in Gothic church windows, as well as to the various coloured glass artworks of the ancients. The designation encaustic or encausticum became so widespread it was even attributed to things that had no claim to it at all, because they were durable without any help from fire. Yes, it was even applied to book painting, coloured writing materials, common ink writing itself, and, with a slight change of the last syllable, to deeds and archives. This is the meaning and history of the word encaustic. After the technique itself had been lost for several centuries, Memory of it was revived in the second half of the last century, but solely in reference to ancient painting. The learned Count Caylus had the merit of first reintroducing it. In energetic and inventive France, many scholars and artists followed him who were interested in recovering the method. However, instead of discovering the ancient Greek method, they invented entirely different ones. Some of these methods were cleverly conceived and useful in various respects, yet all of them bear clear signs of the decisive influence of modern oil painting. Occasionally, experiments were also made in England, Italy, and Germany to revive Greek encaustic with renewed zeal, but without success, and the matter was abandoned. Most distinguished among these was Abbot Racano, who came closer than anyone else to the Greek method, without, however, establishing anything important or definitive, for he believed he had already found the complete method without sufficiently penetrating the matter, and moreover allowed himself to fall into serious errors. Now let us hear the naturalist Pliny, the only ancient author who explicitly mentions the encaustic method of painting. He says, "It is known that from ancient times 2 types of encaustic painting existed, one with wax and on ivory using the cestrum, that is, the burning stylus, until people began painting warships. This became the 3rd type, in which wax colours are fused by fire and the brush is used. These paintings on ships suffer neither from sun, nor seawater, nor rain." The preparation of the wax tablets for painting, only briefly mentioned, is the explanation of the first kind of encaustic. The wax was melted in a vessel over glowing coals. Finely ground earth pigment was mixed in as much as it could absorb, and then this mixture was applied to wood or wall with the hot spatula and spread as evenly as possible. It hardened as soon as it was applied, and thus formed the ground on which the drawing hand engraved lines with a cold, pointed stylus. If corrections were needed, the grooves of the erroneous lines could easily be smoothed over again with the aforementioned hot spatula. To make the lines immediately visible, the wax ground had to be applied thinly, which also avoided smudging from the hand and made the drawing freer. One can understand that it was not the painting, but the wax ground that was burned in, and this burning in gave painting only indirectly the name encaustic. But wax was used on walls just as much as on wood, especially in temples where life-size figures appeared. In fact, the white wall under the dark wax crust of the drawing was much more advantageous than the less white colour of the larch wood. Examples of wall paintings include those at Ardea and Lanuvium, which I will mention again shortly, as well as others noted by Strabo that were found in the Temple of Diana in a grove at the mouth of the Alpheus River near Pisa in Elis. One depicted the fall of Troy and the birth of Minerva, the other Diana flying through the air on a griffin. The painters Clenthes and Arinthes, both from Corinth, divided the work between them. This Clenthes is undoubtedly the same one said to have invented linear painting. I have no doubt that these paintings were done in wax on walls, since Pliny treats those at Ardea, Lanuvium and elsewhere as the same kind of work, and their great age shows that they could only have been engraved drawings on a monochrome wax ground spread over a wall. The interpreters of this type of encaustic did not distinguish it from another similar kind that arose much later. Indeed, they even substituted the latter in its place, in which they were quite mistaken, as I will clearly show when explaining the later encaustic. Pliny himself made a serious oversight by not marking the difference between the older and the younger type of encaustic painting with dry wax colours, which brought much confusion into the history of painting techniques. A confusion I believe I have found the way out of. The second, perhaps equally ancient manner follows, which Pliny likewise treats briefly, namely encaustic painting on ivory. This type of painting has prompted all sorts of interpretations, none of which are well-founded. One writer imagines that, using his own words, the burning stylus on ivory was what the brush is in oil painting, the tool with which one painted animals, humans, and other things on ivory, that it was made hot to burn in the outline and shadow and thus express them, and that for this reason the painting is called encaustic, meaning something that is burned in. He further asserts that it was nothing more than black and white, light and shadow, without any intermediate colours, and resembled the incised and blackened works on ivory, wood and metal. A later author, who probably copied this countryman of his, agrees entirely, except that he claims the ivory was coloured before the work began. Yet another, from the same nation, simply and vaguely states that a glowing stylus was used to draw and shade on ivory, producing an image like those seen on the gourd flasks of pilgrims and beggars. The remaining opinions, most of which align with these, I shall pass over in silence. Nothing is more common than to form unfavourable judgments about things one has made no real effort to understand. In the minds of these authors, burning in a drawing on ivory is a settled and simple matter because they have never attempted it and been disabused of their error. For even if incising is feasible, burning in or colouring the incised lines brown is not easy. The tip of the engraving tool or stylus, however hot, cools immediately, causing the most tedious delays and vexing loss of time. The so-called crude work, as the French encyclopedists call it, could not have been such a linear drawing, as this would contradict the progress of art even in its earliest years. Here is my opinion on this kind of painting. When the art of outlines began to become significant, that is, when one had achieved some degree of perfection with drawings on tablets of hard wax, there was a desire to carry out this work in miniature, for which there was already a preference on ivory. This material was then held in the highest esteem and thus matched the high regard in which painting in general was held. Ivory tablets were therefore coated with black or red wax, and the drawing was incised into them with the stylus, with the intent that the clean, smooth white surface of the ivory would serve to express the lines clearly. It was therefore nothing more or less than the same encaustic work, except on ivory in miniature, rather than on wood or walls in large format. Due to the difference in material and scale, the same method appeared in the same form but under two different aspects. I interpret the phrase cera in ebori sestro, wax on ivory with the burning stylus, in this way. The word cera I previously connected with sestrum, the tool. Now I relate both to what follows, wax on ivory with the burning stylus. That this method, as painting progressed through practical means, improved and refined itself, I have every reason to assume, even though Pliny gives no hint of it. Consequently, I imagine that the hard lines of the old style evolved into soft and flowing ones, still with attention to the rendering of light and shadow. First, the sketch was done with a needle. Then the faint lines were broadened with a wider tool where they were meant to indicate shadow, so the deepest shadow was the widest line and more of the ivory showed through. Thus the drawing was entirely similar to that on earthenware, only with the difference that here it was white, while there it was black. In this form, I believe stylus drawing on ivory persisted for a long time. There is evidence that it lasted until the decline of the Roman Republic. For Lalla of Cyzicus, who rivaled the best portrait painters in the dominant brush technique and particularly excelled in female portraits, even painting life-size figures, engaged in this kind of work. After this artist, however, there are no further mentions of such works, and even under the Antonines, who supported Greek art in all its branches and forms, there is silence about it. I think I am not mistaken in believing that encaustic painting on ivory among the ancients was something like what miniature painting is for us, namely intended for portraits in half-length and perhaps full-length, or even images of the gods, though always in profile. I imagine that several of these tablets were joined together in the manner of diptychs, carried on one's person, and sent like letter tablets. It is known that Christian Greeks carried painted images of saints on several small folding tablets and used them for private devotion. The devout of the Greek Church still do so in part today, and this is the origin and treatment of the first and oldest method of encaustic wax painting, with the hot spatula, used for large works on wood and walls and for small works on ivory. Just as the crude need to incise writing had led to the discovery of wax, so too had the crude incision of outlines led to the need for wax, and thus painting, even in the dawn of its existence, was already wax painting. Now we also understand why in this earliest painting the lines were white. The division of this encaustic type into two, as Pliny makes, is arbitrary and incorrect, for it is only one and the same type. The difference lies solely in the material containing the wax ground, not in the method of painting, and he might just as well have made encaustic on walls a third type if he named that on ivory as the second. He should have grouped all three into one, the first and oldest type, and said, with wax on wood, wall, and ivory. What follows is a completely different way of painting, which is listed as the third kind of encaustic. But the time to speak of it has not yet come, as doing so would disrupt the order that art followed in its development toward perfection, and Pliny himself, though he does not make it explicit, has nonetheless given the careful reader enough to deduce this chronological progression. However, I must not forget to speak of the durability and permanence of encaustic wax painting, something that in our time has been much praised and has given rise to serious attempts at its revival, albeit without distinguishing between its various types. Yet this distinction is important when considering this much vaunted advantage. Since we will likely never see an encaustic wax painting from the best period of Greek art to verify this ourselves, let us consult Pliny on the matter. To understand the durability of encaustic wax painting, we must first say something about the nature of wax itself. Wax is a resinous substance mixed with a peculiar fatty element which makes it soft and pliable. I have found that wax from southern regions is drier, while wax from northern regions is fattier. Hence, the former is better suited for wax painting, especially the third kind. The intimate cohesion of its components, especially once it is polished, makes it impermeable to water, heat, cold, and even the most corrosive dust. White wax, when deprived of air, easily yellows, but in the presence of air, it brightens again. Air, in fact, is wax's natural element and causes it to become ever drier and harder. Among other things, I have seen 2 wax candles, each about 10 spans tall, standing in the church of La Madonna del Monte before the gate of San Mamolo in Rome. They were placed there before the high altar by the Bakers' Guild in 1445, as an old inscription testifies. From a distance, they resembled tall white marble columns meant to hold candles. I broke off a piece. Inside and out, the wax was completely white, dry and hard. This shows how beautifully the wax had preserved itself for over 360 years and will continue to do so as long as conditions allow. Now, it will be easy to see why wax painting can resist the ravages of time. Since wax, when mixed with earth pigments, becomes even drier and harder, and since these pigments are themselves so fully permeated by the wax as to become wax-like, the changing effects of moisture, heat and cold have no impact. Thus the wax colour remains ever the same, fresh and new. Let us now hear the promised evidence from Pliny. Marcus Agrippa, he says, inserted small painted shields in the marble walls of the hottest room of his baths, removing them shortly beforehand because the baths were to be aired. This speaks to wax painting in general, that it withstands the greatest heat. But the first kind of this painting in particular can boast exceptional permanence even under other adverse conditions, as our author attests with the aforementioned paintings at Ardea and Lanuvium. Certainly, he says, there are still today paintings in a sacred building at Ardea that are older than our city and deserve all my admiration, having stood exposed without a roof for so long and yet still looking as fresh as new. Similarly, at Lanuvium, there were paintings of Atalanta and Helen, both nude, painted side by the same master, paintings that were not even damaged when the temple collapsed. There are surely even older, well-preserved wax paintings. Regarding another painting, he reports that the Adols Murena and Varro cut it from a wall in Sparta and had it fitted into wood and brought to Rome. If the wall coating was as hard as that of the temple at Lanuvium, then the builder who removed it must have devised a special technique to do so without damaging the painting, so that, as Pliny notes, this successful extraction was admired even more than the painting itself. Be that as it may, it was undoubtedly an old encaustic wax painting of extraordinary beauty, namely of great value in terms of drawing. That it was a fresco painting, as the phrase opus tectorium might suggest, I cannot admit, because this type of painting was invented only much later when the art was already in decline. Hence, No one would have gone to such lengths for a new painting executed in an imperfect method. Opus Tectorium, in my view, here merely indicates that it was a wall painting and not on wood. Such are the ambiguities of certain ancient expressions, especially technical ones, as I will soon offer another example. So we may fully trust Pliny that even older, well-preserved wax paintings existed than those he listed, just as we still find well-preserved pigments from time immemorial whose method of application is unknown, yet which have lasted for ages. To this day, there are paintings and painted hieroglyphs in Egypt, on walls, marble and granite, in tombs, temples and obelisks. As one careful traveller said, they cannot be scraped off, and I must confess that this kind of coating surpasses everything I have ever seen in the art. It is astonishing how the gold, the blue and other colours have retained their brilliance to this day. I will share my opinion on the binding medium for these colours elsewhere. This is the character of wax painting on walls, but it holds the same for wood, as long as the wood itself endures, as we shall hear, in its place. Moreover, I have no hesitation in believing that white wax was used from the very beginning, for pure and dry white wax suited encaustic much better than tough yellow wax. White wax was called Punic wax. Presumably the Phoenicians had long ago discovered how to bleach wax and kept this invention secret in order to monopolize trade in white wax, until the secret was eventually revealed and wax bleaching became widespread, though the name Punic wax remained. Dioscorides and Pliny tell us how wax was bleached in their time. It was repeatedly boiled in seawater, which removed its fat and brought it closer to resin. The Latins called encaustic paintings cera, after the wax, without regard to the differences in methods by which the paintings were made or the manner in which the colours were applied and fixed by heat. This has led to many ambiguous and unsatisfactory references to painting. The same goes for the words encaustum and inustum, which poets in particular use for any wax painting, and thus much for now on encaustic and its oldest form. Chapter 16, Continuation of Greek History in regard to the nation's perfection. The condition under which man was to be brought to himself, that is, to the recognition of the ultimate purpose of his existence and to the concept of his happiness, was of immense scope and seemed to exceed human powers, for it was imposed upon man at a time when the harshness of his condition or the instinct of self-preservation occupied him too intensely for him to share his strength with another aim. And yet he had to use this very strength for that purpose. He had to become master of the great work upon himself. Not the outer visible form alone, however distinguished and unique it might be, made him truly human, but rather the inner invisible form that he was to give himself, for which he possessed the faculties and abilities. The former was the invitation to develop the latter. It was the mirror held before him, in which he was to see it, to fall in love with it, and to unite himself with it. Only the harmony between the supersensual excellence and the sensual one, between the beauty of the spirit and the beauty of the body, between the divine and the earthly, made him a human being in the only valid sense of the word, whose being is nothing other than his likeness to God. He stood there, a rough-hewn piece of rock, marked with points indicating a future shape, to be detached and formed into this shape, a colossus destined to set his foot on the earth, but to carry his head in the heavens. And this was not the work of a single man or a single human lifetime, but of an entire mass of people and many centuries. The completion of this work was the time when the spirit, constrained by raw sensuality and the pressure of external conditions, liberated itself in proportion to how nature's force, which required it, receded before its advancing superiority. Freedom of the spirit is the drive to act, to govern, to create. The ratio of its freedom to the power of nature determines its strength and superiority or its weakness and impotence. The sum of knowledge and enlightenment, or the opposing lack thereof, determines whether a people becomes self-sufficient and sovereign in the former case, or dependent and enslaved in the latter. In the earliest times of the world, it was therefore easy for a single man to subjugate a great mass of people and found a vast empire. Hence arose the widespread bondage, the enormous gap between people and rulers, the idolatrous veneration of the latter, and the relentless oppression from the former. But when the case arises that supposed enlightenment and so-called refinement, the disguised gravedigger of humanity, slinks around with the dagger of self-love and selfishness, or when the craving for sensuality and excess in the enjoyment of life is regarded as man's highest good and ultimate purpose, then the spirit is weakened, its strength dissolved. In a word, it is robbed of its freedom, and the collapse of entire states becomes inevitable. Then we witness, torn between pity and disgust, how people practically measure themselves out for the lustful enemy and voluntarily surrender to his slaughter knife. The Greeks fought the greatest and longest battle with themselves, with admirable effort and perseverance, and fulfilled that imposed condition to the honour of humanity. The embodiment of the divine in human form endowed them with a philosophical insight that enabled them to discover the essence of God within man. In developing this, they sought out the best and highest within the realm of possibility. Thus, man made himself, according to his destiny, the image of God, a God in miniature. Everything that issued from his faculties was divine within him. He filled the outline of God, deeply engraved within him, with internal lines, and the image grew from a sketch into a finished work. He sought and practiced enlightenment and science not as an end in itself, as an object of vanity, but as a means to perfection and its preservation. He did not cease to make inventions and to improve what had been invented, and the deeper and more urgently the source from which he drew, the more inexhaustible and daring he became in doing so. The source of perfection, God. The urge to act and to create was his need, and the success of this acting and creating intensified this need to the utmost. In other words, the spirit, unleashed and fully conscious of itself, sought to express this as highly as possible. How could it fail to assert the outbursts of its freedom in the social union of men? How could it not attack the ambiguous structure of that society and attempt to subordinate it to itself? The Greeks began to feel autonomy and expressed this feeling with emphasis. Equality in education produced unity in disposition. The people, thus united in inner firmness and strength, recognized the imbalance between dominion and subjugation and placed its superior weight on the two-light scale pan. Every individual citizen, enlightened, educated and experienced, claimed the same prerogatives as the superior and ruler. Thus, it was inevitable that the oldest monarchies gradually transformed into mixed forms of government and ultimately into commonwealths. Hereditary succession was curtailed, altered, or entirely abolished. The people saw itself as the highest authority and worked towards shaping and preserving this dignity through independent legislation and state governance. It tolerated or appointed, as circumstances required, native or foreign, born or non-native kings, with this or that title, either permanently or for a limited time, yet always with a singular regard to noble, that is, free birth verified by personal merits and advantages. The most perfect man already possessed the vocation to be the first citizen, and the citizens confirmed this vocation through election or reverence. All this happened in the heroic age. What we know of it stems from the upheavals caused by the descendants of Heracles, who established themselves in the Peloponnese and seized power. Thebes, Athens, Argos, Elis, Messene, and other small states replaced their monarchical constitutions with democratic ones. Only in Arcadia, Sicyon, and Corinth did the old arrangement under royal authority persist the longest. In Lacedaemon, however, the power of the kings was united with that of the leading citizens, indeed subordinate to them. But since all human institutions are subject to misfortunes, the sources of which lie in the passions, so too were the liberty and peace of the republics here often endangered and disturbed by the rivalry of individual citizens over eligibility for office and their impatience to attain it. In the people there arose men who, with hidden or overt force, knew how to seize power. They acted with that self-confidence with which once Pericles spoke to the people. "You are angry with me," he said, "and I believe that in what a man must know and what can be demanded of him, as well as in the ability to speak about it, I yield to none." No sooner had one such man emerged than it happened in several places, until at last the greater part of Greece had self-appointed rulers, so-called tyrants, a term that, however, did not then carry the hateful meaning we now attach to it. These men achieved their rise mostly through the superiority of their spirit and through the irresistible weapons of eloquence, and they had enough insight not to lose the hard-won and envied victory again through counterproductive behaviour. For having risen above a people raised in greatness of spirit, they could not maintain their position except through tireless efforts to preserve and increase that greatness. Hence they honoured above all the laws, customs, and habits of the people. They did everything that could be useful, pleasant, or flattering to them, and showed a marked enthusiasm for the common spirit of science and art. So much so that Greece, in the roughly 70 years of these men's rule, which Winckelmann wrongly characterises as a dismal time for Greece, made giant strides and found itself very near the goal of perfection. What followed was natural and inevitable. This increasing perfection of the spirit awakened the consciousness of its original freedom, which had seemed to slumber throughout this time, with a force that reproached it for having let itself be held by even the weakest thread. The people were startled by the loss of their rights, felt deceived of them, considered themselves humiliated and disgraced. The love of freedom became unconditional. The bond to the individual was torn, and the tyrants were murdered or expelled. In the history of Athens, which had a decisive influence on the culture of all Greece, we shall trace this further. The reason commonly given for the early refinement and sensitive nature praised in the Athenians is the region they inhabited and the sky that covered them. A barren and infertile soil, it is said, forced the Athenians to wrest their food from it with hard labour, but a mild and cheerful sky refreshed them for the hardships of life, so that the favour of the one and the stinginess of the other combined their effects for the good of this people. Poor in a poor land, it was less exposed to foreign conquests, enjoyed more lasting peace, and was therefore less disturbed in its growth, developing its talents more easily than others, and thus it became cultivated and perfected early, therefore also civil, gentle, and sensitive. At first glance, these reasons seem sufficient, but on closer inspection, they appear forced and false. For if rough mountainous regions and barren land require more toil and labour, how is it that the people who live there are drawn toward refinement of spirit? Are not these hardships the greatest obstacle to it? Does not the geography of the ancient and modern world provide irrefutable evidence of this? While rocky cliffs produce only thistles and scrub, and the hand's breadth of arable land between rocks and chasms, laboriously tilled, barely saves people and livestock from starvation, the beautiful mild sky and the smiling sun can hardly cheer or gladden the spirit or lead it to loftier thoughts than the sorrowful acquisition of food. This stepmotherly soil, this pressing lack of necessities, at which the beautiful sky seems almost to mock, corresponds exactly to the spirit constrained by it, which therefore does not know how to rise above the anxiety of self-preservation until accidental external circumstances enable it to mitigate the animal-like necessities of life and to improve its physical condition. Aetolia, Epirus, Arcadia, and Lacedaemon are for the most part rough and mountainous lands, and the sky smiled just as cheerfully and kindly upon them as over stony and arid Athens. And we know, especially in the case of Arcadia, that it appeared late in the cultivated world of Greece due to its rugged nature, and that Lacedaemon distinguished itself by a stoic renunciation of the pleasures of life in the strictest way of thinking and feeling and in the rough craft of war. So, why did the peoples of these lands not advance in refinement at the same time and to the same degree as the inhabitants of Attic soil? Or why did they not precede them? There must be a particular circumstance that caused this among the Athenians. May I name it, and I hope it will carry all credibility. When Cecrops, an Egyptian refugee, came to the area of what would later be Attica, he brought with him, as mentioned earlier, the worship of the supreme Jupiter and of Pallas Athena to the native inhabitants of the land. On the nearest hill he built a citadel, which he named Cecropia after himself, but dedicated to Athena. At the foot of the citadel dwellings arose, and pious zeal caused the name of the goddess to be extended to the entire community of those dwellings entrusted to her, so that, like a sacred city, it would have full security. Although, as I have said elsewhere, Greece was assigned as the property of various deities. No region, no city bore the name of the deity that possessed it, except for the coastal cities which took theirs from Poseidon or Neptune. Rather, the gods took their surnames from the region and the city in which they were worshipped. Now, the concept of some divine quality was tied to the name of the god, and since the people again recognized their god as their own possession, obedience and self-love made it a duty to be worthy of him. I have already given an explanation of this goddess. Her nature is enlightenment through contemplation of God, in order to come to know oneself through him and learn to ascend to him. Thus, the people who had the good fortune to belong exclusively to this goddess, or as Plutarch says with inspiration, the people of brave Erechtheus, who had been raised by her, the daughter of great Zeus, and had received from her their name, and under all the peoples of Greece bore the name of their own deity, had to strive with all their might to deserve and justify that name. This is the reason why Athens became the gathering place of the most important inventions, the centre of the perfection of all that is good and beautiful, the embodiment of the most benevolent passions, the most delicate feelings, and the highest virtues. This is the cause of why it maintained the first rank in Greece, a rank that all the peoples of Greece acknowledged and that even conquerors did not take away from it. The Athenian state changed its structure gradually, but the liberty of the people only took on a different form, one never brought about by open war, but always dictated solely by love of the fatherland. This is that noble and sublime passion founded on the indigeneity of the inhabitants, called autochthony by the Greeks, as well as on that inner feeling which, as a result of distinction through wisdom and virtue, raises a person above himself. To be a people whose origin, or that of their founder, stemmed from a god or demigod, a people who from the earliest times had remained unique and unblended, belonging solely to their deity, never separated from it, nor from their land, never conquered nor driven out, whose existence and preservation were owed to extraordinary and self-surpassing activity and effort in times both of peace and of danger and adversity, in short, who owed everything to their own merit, and had thereby presented themselves to others as a model for imitation and as an object of admiration and envy. This was the origin of their freedom, their autonomy. This was their nobility. The sense of freedom and love of country were thus one and the same. One must love one's fatherland because it was free, and it was free because one loved it. Codrus, of the line of the Erechtides and the last king of Athens, voluntarily sacrificed himself for his country during the invasion of the Heraclidae. His death marked the end of hereditary rule. Archons followed the kings, first for life, then for 10-year terms. Unlimited power was replaced by limited power. A spark glowed that soon flared into flame. The nobility of the people, that is, the most worthy, had increased, and proud of the right to lead the masses, seized power for themselves. The unrest continued until Solon's noble and unselfish mind gave the Athenians better laws and a new constitution, which he founded on the authority of the people, as the right of the stronger. Hence he called it democracy. The best again became dangerous. New parties strove for exclusive possession of power. The possibility of appropriating it beckoned seductively. The opportunity was irresistibly tempting. The prestige and virtue of the people were to be transferred to proud self-interest and be admired in it. The lot fell to Pisistratus. Charm and compelling eloquence was his goddess of fortune. Twice driven out, he regained power each time. He sought to establish succession within his family, but the people, offended by the degrading thought of being treated by one of their own as hereditary property, and too great to submit patiently to such humiliation, exterminated his line. New upheavals and feuds followed, but all ended with the victorious cry, "Freedom!" Thus, the independent advance toward perfection and the completion of man through it generated the sense of freedom, or the attachment to the fatherland and pride in it, and brought about the political changes in individual states and in all of Greece. There was a constant contest between the people and its rulers for the high prize of greatness in the greatness of both. Rulers and people sought to outdo and supplant one another in the consciousness of their dignity and in just self-respect. The Pisistratids did everything to elevate the Athenian people to first place in Greece, and in that very effort the people found the most effective weapons to destroy their presumptuous power. Unity of sentiment in the feeling of conditional or unconditional freedom was the watchword of Greece against the whole world. Free and steadfast it wished to be, with its large and small states, like the firmament with its small and great stars. Through self-acquired perfection, the Greeks felt entitled to independence and self-rule. They had no hesitation in assigning themselves the highest rank above all, even the most powerful nations, and called them merely barbarians, since in neglecting the pursuit of perfection, they in effect dishonoured humanity. Greece believed and declared itself naturally destined for freedom, whereas the barbarians were born to servitude. Therefore, the Greeks must rule over them and not the reverse. This way of thinking became unshakable and unconquerable in the unification of the many peoples of Greece into a nation through the oracles, the athletic games, the Amphictyonies, or the Great Council of Greece. Now imagine, to sum everything up, a people that made it its first and most sacred duty to earn its life and existence through the recognition and practice of the loftiest principles. Imagine human beings born and raised in the living belief of their divine origin and kinship, their likeness to God, beings who found God in love and beauty, and in the effects of both rejoiced in God and in themselves, savoured both him and themselves. Imagine their striving to develop themselves physically and morally in this regard, to harden and increase their health and nervous strength through all kinds of physical exercise, so as to maintain the power of the spirit and its impulse to act, and to create in free and untiring practice. Imagine the soul overwhelmed by the scope of what was being achieved, yet equipped with courage and perseverance, and again rewarded, nourished, and satisfied by the sight of what had been accomplished, or the mighty, uninterrupted, and inextinguishable fire of inspiration. Imagine the pride and noble self-regard stirred by the view from the awe-inspiring height they had climbed on their own, looking down into the shameful depths of the surrounding world, and the love for their native soil, for their fatherland, for Greece, raised to the level of a passion. This life and activity in strength and action, with united effort, with a shared purpose toward one and the same goal, the fulfillment of that which man owes to himself in order to be truly human, this national union in spirit and feeling for enlightenment, perfection, and human dignity. Imagine it, and stand amazed. And still, all is not yet exhausted, though we are already weary from astonishment. We see what the Greeks were, and that they were so, as history scarcely teaches us to recognise them, since it was only after the dissolution of this nation that the fragments of its greatness were gathered too feebly to piece them back together, so that the world sees the form of the whole only in shadow, by the lamplight of philosophical reflection, colossal but blurred and distorted. Now came the moment when a foreign nation, the Persians, conceived the arrogant plan to subjugate Greece. For the more a people elevates itself, the greater it appears beside a nation with a deluded sense of its own greatness, the more painful it is for that nation to be forced to admire it. The vast expanse of territory the Persians occupied, and the greater age of their culture, which they boasted of, tormented them with the desire to shine alone, and they did not cease to wave the flag of superiority with arrogant fanfare over their heads. But the Persians could not have chosen a more unfortunate time for their undertaking than the present one, in which the freedom of the peoples of Greece seemed to have intertwined its roots in the very heart of the land. The Greeks opposed the blind audacity of the attack with a calm strength and steadfastness sufficient to make even the gods on their icy thrones turn pale, let alone rout a crude army. Triumphant over their enemy and the enemy of their God, they saw in victory the assurance that they were the nation of God. Indeed, their temples lay in ruins, but Persia had written its shame across them, inside and out, in bloody strokes. They even forbade their reconstruction, so that the ruins would remain monuments to the humbled pride of the great king, and from their sacred rubble rose, like a throne, the exalted fame of Greece. Deeply wounded, the Persian king resolved to avenge this disgrace, to bring down the glory of his enemy. He returned with greater might and countless forces. He fought. A stream of his people's blood he directed toward Athens' walls to wash them away. Terrible came the surge, but it recoiled in vain, hurling back weapons and ships, shattered property piled up like a mountain, a new trophy of the invincible nation of God, a mountain that looked down with shaming gaze on twice humiliated Asia and cast its noble, dark shadow to the furthest borders. Thus, a small mass under attack, the Greeks threw down a countless invading horde, the Persians twice, annihilating them with immeasurable loss and disgrace. Athens' inventive wisdom had the greatest share in the rescue of Greece and in the wonders of victory. Yet Athens' moderation in this moment was a new victory over itself, and at the same time another proof of its superiority, for it ascribed the victory to God, left the spoils to the state, and the glory to the nation. And the victory, the spoils and the glory were again shared with science and art, for God, the state, and the nation. And so approached the golden age of Greece. The Persian War completed the marvellous and ideal character of the Greeks, for the likelihood of seeing Persia a third time in the Peloponnese, joined with that wise distrust of future fortune even in the midst of present success, made it a necessity for Greece to prepare itself. The kind of danger it had twice now faced and repelled, unknown before and unique in its nature, now gave it a sense of the grandeur of what it had resisted. This very grandeur became the measure of new exertion, such that Greece allowed itself no other rest or enjoyment than zeal in continuing and completing the work of national perfection, its surest pledge of salvation and security. Just as the spirit, once it reaches the full power of its strength, unifies the scattered into a whole, the manifold into the simple, and subjects everything around it to its nature, that is, to universality and unity, so did it demonstrate this most clearly in the history of Greece in this time. Its strength brought about the desire for exclusive rule over all of Greece, called hegemony, whereas previously individual citizens, confident in their essential merits, had believed themselves called to lead the people and to be the first in the homeland. Now, the same occurred among the most powerful states regarding all of Greece. Athens and Sparta challenged each other, the most beautiful duel for the noblest prize, the prize of preeminence in Greece, the highest burden of being the foremost nation. Superiority in the perfection of human greatness gave the right to it. War decided it, and Athens triumphed. Sparta renewed its strength, and the duel, the Peloponnesian War, began, and Sparta was victorious. Athens had to obey the rule of the 30 tyrants, but soon found in its wounded pride the means to shake off this yoke. Like a spring that pauses and disappears in an earthquake, but soon returns and gushes more abundantly, it recovered so swiftly after the war that it once again rose to be the head of Greece and maintained itself in that position during the following wars. If in ordinary wars, that is, in which ordinary people fight over something less than spiritual greatness, the most harmful changes arise, beneficial institutions are disrupted, trade, science and art are hindered and smothered, prosperity, courage and cheerfulness vanish, poverty and want spread, and with them immorality and disorder. In short, land and people are handed over to ruin. Then in the wars mentioned above, the exact opposite occurred. The reason lay in the subject of these wars, as I have explained it. Hence we need not be surprised that the Olympic, Isthmian and other games were held uninterrupted during hostilities. Indeed, that these were even suspended at times to avoid diminishing the great celebration of human perfection and its splendour. We understand then how it was possible that in times of distress from war, which under different circumstances would have been ruinous, the Muses could push the mighty Ares into the background, continue their dance uninterrupted amidst his savage outcries, and blend the clash of masses and the groans of the dying with their enchanting song. Athens was now greater than ever. What the Pisistratids had begun, Pericles completed, or rather, what the Athenian people were meant to become under the former, they truly became under Pericles. The most beautiful bloom of art appeared, a bloom the world had never seen before, and likely will never see again. Particularly noteworthy here is painting, which reached its long-desired pinnacle of perfection in Athens itself, precisely in the city's most troubled time during the rule of the 30 tyrants. And thus, the review of Greek history after the heroic age up to Alexander the Great offers the most captivating and exalted picture of human greatness and perfection. At the same time, it also allows us to observe that just as Athens especially distinguished itself in this, all of Greece rose along with it, and that, as long as Athens maintained its peak, Greece too sustained itself there. But as soon as Athens began to waver, Greece likewise fell from its height. 17th chapter on the relationship of the plastic arts with each other and the establishment of painting as an independent art. All the arts that are collectively called visual or plastic arts, sculpture, painting, engraving, and others, are so closely related in purpose, means, and effect that they seem to be but different branches of one and the same stem. Yet they are essentially different from one another in the way they are applied and developed, and the precise distinctions that make each one an independent art must be understood in order to avoid confusion and to properly appreciate the significance of each. The first and most primitive purpose of these arts is the representation of the external, visible form of things, most especially of man as the highest, most interesting being. They attempt to seize what is accessible to the senses and to give it a more durable appearance or a more striking expression. Thus they appeal to the eye, which perceives the outlines, proportions, and movements of bodies, and which through seeing imparts these impressions to the mind. Originally, these representations were closely related, and the lines between sculpture and painting were not yet drawn. We know, for example, that the earliest attempts at artistic depiction in Egypt, Asia, and among primitive peoples were painted reliefs or relief-like paintings, so that it is difficult to determine whether the artist intended to create a drawing with colour or a carved form with surface hues. This ambiguity was not a short-lived phase nor an accident of ignorance. Rather, it was a necessary step in the development of the arts. For to develop painting independently as something distinct from sculpture required a new awareness of what precisely characterises the painted surface apart from the sculpt body. And this awareness could only arise once the full potential of sculpture had been realised and the limitations of form alone, without colour, were felt. It is clear that sculpture preceded painting in development and dignity, because form, especially the three-dimensional, is more immediately tied to the human conception of the body, and because the imitation of form seems more natural and easier than the full illusionistic use of line and colour on a flat surface. The earliest monuments of artistic nations, Egyptian, Assyrian and Greek, are sculptural. Painting follows later and remains for some time subordinate, often merely complementing or decorating the sculptural forms. But the natural impulse toward independence and perfection that drives all human endeavour soon led artists to consider what painting could achieve in its own right. They began to notice that colour could do what form alone could not, that the richness of appearances, the vibrancy of life, the softness of flesh, the depth of space, the subtleties of atmosphere could be suggested more convincingly with pigment than with chisel. Thus arose a desire to emancipate painting from its earlier function as mere accessory or embellishment and to give it its own field of action, its own rules, and its own ideal. This was a decisive moment in the history of the arts. It meant the separation of surface from volume, of illusion from substance, of the seen from the touched. The painter ceased to model and began to depict. Instead of suggesting the third dimension by actual projection, he created it through the deception of perspective. What had long been done instinctively or in a rudimentary way became the subject of serious study. Artists investigated how to imitate nature, not through form alone, but through appearance, how light creates shadow, how colours modify and influence one another, how the eye perceives distances, proportions and textures on a flat surface. With this knowledge, painting was founded as an independent art, whose tools were drawing, colour and light, and whose goal was not the duplication of nature, but the creation of a new visual reality, believable though imaginary. The path to this independence was slow, as it always is when a branch separates from a trunk to become its own tree. There were long periods of hesitation, where painting still leaned on sculpture, and artists clung to the habits of form even while venturing into colour. But once the ideal of illusion had taken hold, once the painter saw himself not merely as a craftsman, but as a creator of visible worlds, a new artistic epoch had begun. Painting now stood alongside sculpture, not beneath it. Each had its strengths. Sculpture presented the dignity and permanence of form. Painting offered the richness and vitality of appearance. Sculpture could represent what is. Painting could suggest what could be, what is felt, what is fleeting. Together they formed a complete expression of human perception, solid and spectral, tangible and visible, eternal and momentary. And each gained in power by the contrast and cooperation with the other. This new independence of painting was not merely a technical achievement, but a cultural one. It reflected the intellectual and spiritual maturity of the Greek people, who had learned to distinguish not only between different kinds of artistic practice, but also between the levels of reality they represented. Sculpture, grounded in physical form, became the art of the eternal and unchanging. Painting, rooted in light and colour, became the art of the momentary and emotional. Both shared the task of expressing the divine through the human, but each approached it from a different side. The Greeks, with their instinct for proportion and clarity, were the first to fully grasp and cultivate this distinction. It was not enough for them that a painted image resembled a real thing. It had to be organised according to rules of harmony and ideality. And so the early painters began to study the laws of visual perception and to formulate principles for their art. These principles of symmetry, proportion, balance, and expression were grounded not in imitation alone, but in the higher aim of idealization. In this way, painting gradually separated itself from the more tactile, weighty world of sculpture and moved into the domain of the eye and the imagination. It became the art of semblance, of that which is not materially there, but which seems to be. This illusionism, far from being a deception, was seen as a triumph of human creativity, the power to summon before the senses what does not exist in nature, and to make it live with such force that it affects the viewer as if it were real. This required a new kind of training and insight. The painter had to understand not just anatomy and form, but the behaviour of light, the psychology of colour, the nature of air and space, the movement of bodies, and the emotions they express. He had to learn how to suggest volume without mass, texture without substance, depth without excavation. His canvas was flat, but he had to make it seem infinite. His materials were dry powders and oils, yet he had to make them breathe. The greatest achievement of Greek painting, then, was not in the mere reproduction of appearances, but in the invention of a visual language that could express the inner life of things. While sculpture embodied the external perfection of the gods, painting suggested their moods, their presence, their hidden natures. It could show what was invisible, feeling, character, fate, by means of colour, gesture and light. And by doing so, it brought the divine closer to the human, just as it raised the human toward the divine. From this moment onward, painting ceased to be a servant of other arts and became a sovereign discipline. It no longer merely decorated architecture or emphasized sculptural form. It created its own sacred spaces, its own mythologies, its own philosophy of beauty. The temple wall became a theatre, the panel a window into another world. What had once been a craft was now an art in the highest sense, a mode of knowing, a form of truth. Thus, the evolution of painting from decorative function to independent art mirrors the development of Greek culture itself, from unity through instinct to complexity through understanding, from the collective to the individual, from the visible to the visionary. Just as Greek religion began with images of power and ended in ideals of perfection, so Greek art moved from solidity to appearance, from mass to light, from presence to expression. And in this movement, painting found its essence, the art of making the invisible visible, the fleeting eternal, the human divine. This transformation did not occur all at once. The earliest painters still leaned heavily on the traditions of sculpture and craft. Their figures were stiff, their compositions symmetrical, their colours flat. They borrowed poses and proportions from statues, and often their works served merely as coloured outlines on architectural surfaces. But over time, through observation, experimentation, and philosophical reflection, the Greeks refined their techniques and deepened their understanding of what painting could achieve. Key to this development was the discovery of perspective, not in the mathematical sense later perfected in the Renaissance, but in the intuitive sense of arranging figures and space to create the illusion of depth. Painters began to overlap forms, to vary the size of objects by distance, to hint at a background behind the foreground. They also learned to modulate colour, to use light and shadow, chiaroscuro, to suggest atmosphere and mood. In doing so, they invented not only a new visual language, but a new way of seeing. This way of seeing was not limited to the eyes. It was intellectual and emotional. The painted image could provoke thought, stir memory, inspire awe. It was not passive or merely decorative. It engaged the viewer in a dialogue, a relationship. The viewer, too, had to learn to see, to recognise beauty not only in form but in expression, to understand the symbolic and emotional content of a painted scene, to feel the drama it portrayed. And so painting came to reflect the ideals of the Greek spirit: clarity, balance, humanity, transcendence. It was a visual counterpart to philosophy, poetry, and music. Just as the tragedians expressed the human condition in words and the philosophers in concepts, the painters did so in images. And like them, they sought not just to please, but to elevate, to awaken the soul to its highest potential. This was the golden age of Greek painting, when artists such as Polygnotus, Zeuxis, Parrhasius, Apelles and others created works that were celebrated not only for their technical mastery, but for their spiritual power. These painters were not mere artisans, but thinkers and visionaries. They were honoured as much for their wisdom as for their skill, and their works were regarded as embodiments of truth and virtue. Unfortunately, few, if any, of their original paintings have survived. What we know of them comes from descriptions, imitations, and echoes in later art. But even in this fragmentary form, their legacy endures. They established the principles of painting as an independent art, an art that, though it could imitate nature, aimed above all to reveal the inner form, the essence, the ideal. In this sense, painting completed the Greek artistic revolution. It gave form to the invisible, expression to the eternal, and in doing so, it brought art closer to philosophy and philosophy closer to life. It made beauty not only something to behold, but something to understand and to become. It turned the eye into a path to the soul. Thus, the art of painting rose to the height of a science and even of a philosophy in the full sense of the word. It became a means for expressing what the soul felt, what the intellect grasped, and what the heart yearned for. It no longer merely imitated the external world, but interpreted it and elevated it through the lens of human idealism. The painted image was no longer just a copy, it was a vision. Painters strove for charis, the divine grace that infused form with life, and euphrosine, the cheerful clarity that shone through harmony and proportion. Every figure became a revelation of inner character, every composition a carefully orchestrated order of emotions and ideas. Painting achieved, like no other art, a union of the sensual and the spiritual, of the individual and the universal. This is why the most distinguished philosophers of Greece did not disdain to speak of painting in their doctrines. Socrates, though not a painter, engaged in conversations about its principles. Plato, despite his suspicion of images, admired their power to awaken the longing for the ideal. Aristotle recognized in painting an educative force, a way to purify emotion through representation, just as tragedy did in poetry. Such was the esteem in which painting was held that it stood side by side with the other liberal arts, influencing and being influenced by them in turn. It took from poetry its narrative depth, from music its rhythm, from philosophy its truth-seeking spirit, and in return it gave to all of them something essential, a form made visible, a vision made enduring. In sum, Greek painting did not merely mirror the development of Greek culture, it embodied it. It was the image of a nation that sought to know itself, to perfect itself, and to express the highest ideals through beauty. From its mythic origins in the tracing of a shadow to its apex in the works of Apelles and his peers, it was a journey from matter to meaning, from instinct to insight, from surface to soul.